I had been planning the cabin trip for months, organizing everything meticulously. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant hum of the city, from the weight of responsibilities that had been pressing down on me for years. The idea of a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods seemed like a perfect escape, a way to reconnect with myself, to find a silence that the city could never offer. I packed my bag carefully, choosing practical clothing, sturdy boots, and extra layers, since the nights could be bitterly cold at this altitude. I took food that would last, water, a small camping stove, and a first aid kit, along with a battery-powered lantern and spare batteries. I didn't pack any luxuries, just the essentials. The cabin was off the grid, with no electricity or running water, and I wanted to make sure I had everything I might need. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, roads narrowing as I approached the mountain pass. The trees pressed in closer with each mile, their thick trunks dark against the fading sunlight. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the sky was beginning to turn shades of deep orange and red, streaked with gray clouds that hinted at rain. The air had a chill to it that made my skin prickle, a sharp reminder that this place was untouched, raw, and entirely indifferent to human presence. I parked the car at the edge of a small clearing and took in the cabin from a distance. It was modest, built entirely of wood, weathered by time and the elements, its roof streaked with moss. A thin trail of smoke rose faintly from the chimney, though I knew it wasn't smoke. There had been no one there for days. The cabin looked abandoned yet solid, a shelter that had clearly survived many harsh winters. I hoisted my bag over my shoulder and began the short hike along the overgrown path, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. The first thing I noticed when I entered the cabin was the smell. It was the scent of closed spaces, of wood that had absorbed moisture over the years, of earth and decay that had been pressed into the corners where the floorboards met the walls. The air was heavy and cool, carrying the faint smell of mold and something metallic, like rust or old water. I set my bag down near the door and took a moment to survey the interior. The cabin had one main room, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a sink that hadn't seen running water in years, and a few shelves holding dusty cans and jars. There was a narrow loft above, reachable by a steep wooden ladder, which I assumed served as the sleeping area. The windows were grimy, letting in dim light but providing a view of the dense forest outside. After setting my things down, I explored the cabin more thoroughly. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I had to watch my step carefully, wary of rotten wood that might give way. The walls were lined with old hooks and shelves, many empty, some holding remnants of past occupants. A broken lantern, a stack of yellowed newspapers, a cracked ceramic mug. There was a small box tucked into a corner that held some old nails and screws, possibly left for someone to make repairs. The sense of abandonment pressed on me, yet there was also a strange feeling of safety within these thick wooden walls, as though the cabin itself had endured decades of storms and isolation and would endure a few more days of mine. The first night came fast. I lit a small fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room as the shadows danced along the walls. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees and rattling against the cabin's thin shutters. The sound was constant and unrelenting, a reminder that I was not in control here. I ate a simple meal, canned beans warmed over the stove, and drank water from a bottle, careful not to drink too much at once in case my supply dwindled. I placed my lantern on the table and settled into a folding chair, staring into the flames as they crackled and popped, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist in the corners. Sleep did not come easily. I lay in the loft, my body pressed against the narrow mattress, listening to the night. There was the wind, the distant sound of water dripping somewhere outside, perhaps from the roof or a nearby stream. Then there were the noises closer, subtle but unmistakable. The faint scratching of branches against the cabin walls, the occasional scuttle of some animal across the roof. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was just squirrels or birds, that the forest was alive and I was merely an intruder. But there was a weight to it, an uneasy pressure that made my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, fitful sleep, waking repeatedly at every unusual sound. The next morning, I woke to gray skies and a drizzle that had started sometime in the night. I bundled myself in layers and stepped outside to check the surroundings. The forest was dense, the trees heavy with rain, their branches dripping onto the muddy ground. The trail I had followed to reach the cabin was barely visible through the undergrowth, slick with mud and leaves. I gathered some firewood from nearby, careful to choose dry pieces, though the persistent drizzle made everything damp. The effort was tiring, and I realized quickly how different life here was compared to the city. Every task, even the simplest, required concentration and energy. As the day wore on, I began to notice subtle signs that I was not alone. At first, it was minor. Footprints in the mud around the cabin, too small to be my own, perhaps a raccoon or fox. But the more I looked, the more I realized that some of the tracks were inconsistent with normal animal behavior. They were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, and there were marks on the side of the cabin, scratches that I hadn't noticed before. I told myself it was nothing, that animals could be unpredictable, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of the isolation and the constant tension of being alone in the woods. But a knot of unease had formed in my stomach, a quiet alarm that refused to be silenced. By the third day, the weather had worsened. Rain came in heavier sheets, turning the trails into streams of mud and water. The forest seemed to close in around the cabin, the trees swaying violently in the wind, their branches snapping and falling. I stayed inside as much as possible, keeping the fire alive, rationing food, and maintaining the small sense of order that kept panic at bay. But the noises grew more frequent and more deliberate. Scratches on the walls, footprints outside that didn't belong to any animal I knew, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the porch in the dead of night. Sleep became almost impossible, and my mind began to fixate on worst-case scenarios. One morning, after a particularly restless night, I decided to explore further, hoping that understanding the surroundings might alleviate some of the fear. I took my jacket, a sturdy flashlight, and a small hatchet for protection. The forest was even more oppressive during the day, gray and misty, with rain falling in relentless sheets. As I moved carefully along the trail, I noticed more evidence that someone, or something, had been watching. There were broken branches at eye level, disturbed leaves, and footprints that seemed to stop and start unnaturally, as if whoever had made them had paused to observe the cabin. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to keep moving, rationalizing that I needed to know the area for my own safety. Returning to the cabin, I found the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. The panic that hit me was immediate, a sharp, crushing pressure that made my chest tight. I pushed the door open fully, scanning the interior. Nothing was missing, nothing seemed disturbed inside, yet the feeling of intrusion was unmistakable. I checked every corner, the loft, the small kitchen area, the shelves, and even behind the stove. There was no one there, but the sense of being watched remained. Over the next 2 days, the tension escalated. I began to take precautions, moving my firewood and supplies to different locations, checking the windows frequently, and listening intently to every sound. The forest had become hostile in my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, a potential threat. My meals were eaten quickly, without enjoyment, and my sleep was reduced to short, terrified naps in the loft. The isolation, combined with the constant weather and the sense of being observed, began to wear on me. My thoughts became scattered, my senses hyper-alert, every sound exaggerated. Then, on the 5th night, the real fear set in. I was sitting by the fire when I heard a heavy thump against the side of the cabin. It was deliberate, not like the wind or falling branches. I froze, listening. Another thump followed, then a scraping sound, like claws or nails dragged across the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, my heart racing, and moved cautiously toward the sound. The storm outside was howling, the wind tearing at the trees, rain lashing the windows, making it nearly impossible to see clearly. I could barely make out movement outside, shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light. I stayed awake the entire night, sitting near the loft ladder with the hatchet in my hands. Every noise amplified, every shadow a potential threat. I didn't sleep, Exhaustion claimed brief moments, only to be jolted awake by another sound. The rain had lessened by morning, leaving the forest dripping and silent, almost too silent. I knew I couldn't remain passive. I needed a plan to leave the cabin safely, to get back to civilization without provoking whoever or whatever had been watching. I spent the day preparing. I packed all my things into my bag, making sure nothing was left behind that could weigh me down or be taken. I fortified the door as best as I could with a fallen branch and made sure I had my hatchet ready. I studied the path back to the main road, noting potential obstacles, fallen trees, and areas where the ground might be slippery. I waited until late afternoon, when the light was better, before starting the hike. Every step was calculated, careful, slow, but determined. The forest seemed endless, every tree a barrier, every shadow a possible hiding place. My mind was focused entirely on moving forward, on escaping the cabin that had become a trap of fear and isolation. Hours later, mud-caked, soaked from the remaining drizzle, and exhausted beyond measure, I finally emerged from the dense forest onto the gravel road leading to the main highway. Relief hit me like a wave, heavy and overwhelming. I walked for what felt like miles, until the sound of cars reached me, the hum of civilization washing over the senses like a bomb. A passing vehicle slowed, and I flagged it down, grateful beyond words when the driver offered a ride. By the time I reached a small town, I was trembling from exhaustion, soaked through, but safe. I realized that my fear had been grounded in reality. The cabin was isolated, defenseless, and whatever or whoever had been near it had the advantage. I reported the situation to the local authorities, who later investigated the cabin and surrounding forest. They found signs of human presence. Footprints, temporary campsites hidden in the trees, and evidence of people living in the woods illegally. It explained the scratches, the thumps, and the sense of being watched. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just the very real presence of humans living off-grid in a remote area. I never returned to that cabin. The memory stayed with me, vivid and raw. The oppressive silence, the constant fear, the feeling of being entirely exposed and alone. But I also left with a sense of accomplishment, a survival instinct tested and proven. I had faced the unknown in the woods and had made it back. That clarity, the tangible evidence of danger and survival, stayed with me, a reminder of how real fear can be and how real the relief is when you finally emerge from it. I remember the first time I decided to spend a weekend in a remote cabin. I had been craving solitude, a break from the constant hum of the city, the traffic, and the endless notifications on my phone. Work had been relentless, and I was desperate for silence. I found a listing online for a cabin in the mountains, tucked away near a dense forest. The photos showed a small, rustic log cabin, with a chimney and a porch overlooking a clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. It looked peaceful and inviting. The reviews were few, but positive, and the owner had assured me it was isolated, with no nearby neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, bringing food, water, firewood, and all the essentials. I also brought a first aid kit, extra blankets, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. I didn't want to be unprepared. The drive to the cabin was long. The last stretch was on a narrow, winding dirt road that climbed steeply into the mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the photos. I parked my car on a small patch of gravel, and I stepped out, breathing in the cool mountain air. It smelled like pine and wet earth. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. The wooden porch creaked slightly under my weight as I unloaded my things. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dampness, and something faintly musty. The furniture was simple. A table, a couple of chairs, a small kitchen counter with a stove, and a bed in the corner. There was a wood-burning stove in the center of the room, with a stack of firewood neatly piled next to it. The windows were small, and the glass was slightly warped, giving the outside view a distorted, wavy appearance. I liked that. It made the forest outside feel alive, shifting with every movement of the wind. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin and its surroundings. The clearing was small, maybe 100 feet across, bordered by thick trees. There were footprints in the dirt, probably from deer or raccoons, and a few broken branches where small animals had run through. The air was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The sun disappeared completely behind the mountains as I prepared my dinner. I lit a small fire in the stove and heated canned beans, adding some spices I had brought. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the smell of the fire, the feeling of being completely alone. After dinner, I decided to take a walk in the clearing. The moon was rising, bright and full, casting silver light through the trees. I had brought a flashlight but didn't need it yet. The forest looked different at night, heavier somehow, as if every shadow carried weight. I walked slowly, stepping over roots and broken branches, listening carefully. There were sounds of animals, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, but nothing alarming. I circled the cabin and returned to the porch, feeling a mixture of peace and unease. Being alone in the forest at night was beautiful, but it also made me aware of how vulnerable I really was. I went inside and locked the doors, checking that all the windows were latched. The cabin didn't have electricity beyond a small solar-powered light, so I lit a few candles. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the chair by the window, staring out at the forest. Hours passed slowly. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of wet pine and the distant tang of smoke from a far-off fire. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I had prepared for everything. Yet, as the night deepened, I started to feel an unease I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling that makes you aware of every creak, every shadow. Then I heard it, a snapping sound outside, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I had heard that bears could wander close to cabins in these mountains. But the sound was different. It was deliberate. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the forest toward the clearing. My heart began to race. I kept quiet, trying to listen. Another snap, closer this time. Something or someone was moving through the trees. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight. I shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, tall and dark, standing just at the treeline. My pulse shot up. I knew I was alone, but here was someone, or something, watching me. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there. I fumbled for my phone to call the police, only to realize I had no signal. The cabin was too remote. I cursed under my breath and tried to stay calm. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tightly, my knuckles white. The figure stepped forward, moving into the clearing, slowly, deliberately. My mind raced. This was no animal. It was a person. Someone had followed me here, someone who knew I was alone. My first thought was to barricade myself inside. I pushed a chair against the door, stacked some firewood, and stayed low, hiding behind the table. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking around. I couldn't see their face, just the outline against the moonlight. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to do something, and I had to do it carefully. I remembered the cabin's back door. It led to a small trail that went downhill through the forest, eventually connecting to the main road. It was risky, but it was my only chance. I waited until the figure moved slightly away from the front of the cabin. Then I crept quietly to the back door, knife in hand. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly I thought they might hear it. I opened the door slowly and slipped outside, staying low, hugging the shadows of the trees. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and I stumbled several times over roots and rocks. Each time I looked back, the figure was closer, moving with a strange confidence, as if they knew the land. I ran faster, trying to ignore the pain in my legs, the burning in my lungs. The forest seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled over a fallen tree and fell hard, scraping my hands and knees. I pushed myself up, shaking, and kept moving. I could hear them behind me now, faster, closer. My mind raced with every possible scenario. Fight, hide, run. I had no choice but to run. I followed the trail downhill, slipping into a small ravine, using the trees for cover. The moonlight barely reached the forest floor, but I remembered the trail from the daylight walk. I stumbled over rocks and roots, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint glow ahead headlights. I realized I had made it to the main road. I ran into the middle of the dirt path and waved my arms, shouting as loud as I could. The car slowed, and a man leaned out the window. I ran toward it, tears streaming down my face, falling into the seat, trying to catch my breath. I told him to drive, just drive as fast as possible. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. I called the police once I reached a place with signal. They took my statement and sent a unit to the cabin. Later, I learned that the figure had been a criminal who had been hiding in the area, targeting isolated cabins for robbery. They had left by the time the police arrived, but they were still searching. I stayed with friends for the next few nights, unable to sleep, reliving every step of that night. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. The small precautions I had taken, locking doors, bringing a knife, knowing the trail, probably saved my life. I also realized the importance of respecting isolation. The mountains were beautiful, but they were also dangerous if you weren't careful. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me something important. Preparation and calm thinking could mean the difference between life and death. Eventually, I returned to the city. The memory of the cabin lingered, the forest, the dark figure, and the fear I had felt. I never went back, but I learned to appreciate the quiet of the city again, the safety of being around people. I never forgot the smell of the pine, the chill of the night, or the sound of footsteps breaking through the stillness. Even now, I sometimes dream of that night, of running through the forest, of the figure watching me from the shadows. But I also remember the relief, the headlights in the darkness, the sound of the car engine carrying me to safety. That night taught me about fear, vigilance, and survival. It taught me that being alone doesn't mean being powerless, and that sometimes the scariest moments are the ones that are completely real. And so, I carry that lesson with me, always aware, always prepared, always remembering the cabin in the mountains, the darkness, and the sound of someone, or something, moving just beyond the trees. It is a memory that stays with me, clear and vivid, but it also reminds me that even in the darkest, scariest moments, there is always a way to survive if you keep your wits and move carefully. I remember the first time I decided to spend a weekend in a remote cabin. I had been craving solitude, a break from the constant hum of the city, the traffic, and the endless notifications on my phone. Work had been relentless, and I was desperate for silence. I found a listing online for a cabin in the mountains, tucked away near a dense forest. The photos showed a small, rustic log cabin, with a chimney and a porch overlooking a clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. It looked peaceful and inviting. The reviews were few, but positive, and the owner had assured me it was isolated, with no nearby neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, bringing food, water, firewood, and all the essentials. I also brought a first aid kit, extra blankets, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. I didn't want to be unprepared. The drive to the cabin was long. The last stretch was on a narrow, winding dirt road that climbed steeply into the mountains. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the photos. I parked my car on a small patch of gravel, and I stepped out, breathing in the cool mountain air. It smelled like pine and wet earth. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. The wooden porch creaked slightly under my weight as I unloaded my things. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dampness, and something faintly musty. The furniture was simple. A table, a couple of chairs, a small kitchen counter with a stove, and a bed in the corner. There was a wood-burning stove in the center of the room, with a stack of firewood neatly piled next to it. The windows were small, and the glass was slightly warped, giving the outside view a distorted, wavy appearance. I liked that. It made the forest outside feel alive, shifting with every movement of the wind. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin and its surroundings. The clearing was small, maybe 100 feet across, bordered by thick trees. There were footprints in the dirt, probably from deer or raccoons, and a few broken branches where small animals had run through. The air was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The sun disappeared completely behind the mountains as I prepared my dinner. I lit a small fire in the stove and heated canned beans, adding some spices I had brought. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the smell of the fire, the feeling of being completely alone. After dinner, I decided to take a walk in the clearing. The moon was rising, bright and full, casting silver light through the trees. I had brought a flashlight but didn't need it yet. The forest looked different at night, heavier somehow, as if every shadow carried weight. I walked slowly, stepping over roots and broken branches, listening carefully. There were sounds of animals, an owl hooting in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, but nothing alarming. I circled the cabin and returned to the porch, feeling a mixture of peace and unease. Being alone in the forest at night was beautiful, but it also made me aware of how vulnerable I really was. I went inside and locked the doors, checking that all the windows were latched. The cabin didn't have electricity beyond a small solar-powered light, so I lit a few candles. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the chair by the window, staring out at the forest. Hours passed slowly. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of wet pine and the distant tang of smoke from a far-off fire. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I had prepared for everything. Yet, as the night deepened, I started to feel an unease I couldn't shake. It was the kind of feeling that makes you aware of every creak, every shadow. Then I heard it, a snapping sound outside, like a branch breaking under a heavy weight. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I had heard that bears could wander close to cabins in these mountains. But the sound was different. It was deliberate. Heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the forest toward the clearing. My heart began to race. I kept quiet, trying to listen. Another snap, closer this time. Something or someone was moving through the trees. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlight. I shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure, tall and dark, standing just at the treeline. My pulse shot up. I knew I was alone, but here was someone, or something, watching me. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there. I fumbled for my phone to call the police, only to realize I had no signal. The cabin was too remote. I cursed under my breath and tried to stay calm. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it tightly, my knuckles white. The figure stepped forward, moving into the clearing, slowly, deliberately. My mind raced. This was no animal. It was a person. Someone had followed me here, someone who knew I was alone. My first thought was to barricade myself inside. I pushed a chair against the door, stacked some firewood, and stayed low, hiding behind the table. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking around. I couldn't see their face, just the outline against the moonlight. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. Life in the city had been exhausting, with constant noise, endless traffic, and the kind of stress that gnawed at the back of my mind even when I was asleep. I had found a small, rustic cabin deep in the forest through an online listing. It was remote, far from any town or other houses, and it promised silence, privacy, and a complete escape from everything. The photos showed a small wooden structure nestled among tall pines, with a dirt path leading to it, a small porch, and a stone fireplace inside. It looked isolated, but not in a scary way, at least not at first glance. I packed my car the night before, taking everything I thought I would need. Enough food for a week, water, blankets, batteries, a first aid kit, and tools in case something went wrong. I even packed extra firewood for the cabin stove, thinking about long evenings of warmth and reading. The drive there was long and winding, taking me through small country roads that became narrower and emptier as I got closer. At some points, I couldn't see anyone else for miles, and the only sounds were my car tires on the gravel and the occasional bird. By the time I reached the last turnoff toward the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the road. The cabin appeared exactly as in the photos. It was small, with dark brown wooden walls and a metal roof that reflected the fading sunlight. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, which I assumed was from the previous occupant, or maybe the caretaker who occasionally stopped by. The area around the cabin was overgrown, but there was a clearing large enough for my car. As I stepped out, I noticed the smell of damp earth mixed with pine resin. It was peaceful, almost intoxicating, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I spent the first few hours inside settling in. The cabin was simple. A main room with a small kitchen area, a fireplace, a table, a couple of chairs, and a loft area above that I could sleep in. The walls had shelves with old, dusty dishes, some cooking pots, and a stack of firewood near the fireplace. The windows were small but thick, and the light from outside cast long shadows across the floor. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping area, and prepared a small fire. I had no intention of turning on any electronic devices. Part of the reason I came here was to disconnect completely. The first night was uneventful, though I did notice the sounds of the forest were much louder than I expected. Wind rustled through the trees, branches tapped against the roof, and I could hear small animals moving outside. At one point, a sharp scratching sound made me freeze. It came from near the back of the cabin. I held my breath, thinking it might be a raccoon or a squirrel. After a few moments, it stopped, and I tried to relax. The unfamiliar sounds made me hyper-aware, but I reminded myself it was normal in the forest. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow path that led deeper into the woods, overgrown but still passable. I brought a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and my phone, although I knew service would be spotty at best. The forest was dense, and sunlight barely filtered through the tall pines. I walked slowly, taking in the quiet, listening to birds, and watching squirrels dart between branches. It felt isolated but not threatening, at least at first. As I explored, I noticed signs that wildlife was active nearby. Tracks in the dirt suggested deer had been passing through recently, and I spotted scat from some smaller animals. I kept my senses alert, knowing that larger predators could be in the area, even if encounters were rare. The air smelled damp and earthy, and there was a subtle chill despite the early morning sun. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin, feeling satisfied with my little hike and ready to rest before preparing lunch. By the third day, I had settled into a routine. Mornings were for exploring or collecting firewood, afternoons for cooking or reading by the fireplace, and evenings for observation. I noticed how the forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't appreciated before. Every sound felt amplified. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk. I felt connected to the environment but also increasingly aware of the isolation. The further I ventured into the woods, the more I realized there was no one around for miles. It was on that third night that the first real unease crept in. I had gone outside to check the perimeter of the cabin before bed. The moon was almost full, casting a silver light over the clearing. I walked along the edge of the forest, listening for the usual rustling of animals. Then I heard something unusual, a soft crunching noise on the dirt path that led from the main road to the cabin. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I froze and strained my eyes, trying to see through the dark. There was nothing, but the sound came again, closer this time, and then stopped. I didn't panic immediately. I rationalized it. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had stepped on twigs, but my gut told me something was off. The sounds of the forest had a rhythm, a pattern, and these steps didn't fit. They were heavy, measured, like someone walking carefully. I returned to the cabin quickly and locked the doors, checking that the windows were shut. I stayed awake for hours listening, but nothing happened. The next day, I tried to ignore it, though I noticed small signs that something or someone might have been near the cabin. My firewood pile had shifted slightly, and a small branch I hadn't moved was lying across the path. I convinced myself it could be animals, but the thought lingered in my mind. By the 5th day, my sense of isolation had deepened. I started carrying a small hatchet with me whenever I went outside, mostly for reassurance. I also began checking the perimeter more thoroughly, looking for any sign of intrusion. That afternoon, while gathering firewood near the edge of the clearing, I saw something that made my heart stop. Faint footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and led from the tree line directly toward the cabin. I froze, staring at them, realizing they stopped just short of the clearing. I had no way of knowing how long they had been there, but it was clear someone had approached the cabin without my knowledge. I returned to the cabin immediately, my mind racing. I checked every door and window, making sure everything was secure. I didn't want to leave, and I didn't want to confront anyone, but I realized the isolation that had seemed so peaceful was now dangerous. For the first time, I understood the vulnerability of being alone in such a remote place. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, keeping the fire going and the hatchet close. As night fell, the unease grew. Every sound outside made me tense. Every shadow looked like a potential threat. Around midnight, I heard it again, the deliberate footsteps, now unmistakably close, circling the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening as they paused, then moved away, then returned. The fear was intense, a constant tightening in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't want to make any noise, didn't want to draw attention to myself. The footsteps continued intermittently through the night, keeping me awake, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay passive. I needed to take action. I had a car, and the main road wasn't far, though it would take time to reach safety. I decided to pack quickly and leave as soon as possible. As I moved through the cabin, checking my belongings, I noticed something disturbing. The small pile of firewood I had stacked neatly outside had been scattered, trampled. There were other small signs of intrusion as well. A door handle slightly turned, a footprint on the porch. Someone had been watching me, or at least had been near enough to touch the cabin. I made the decision to leave immediately. I gathered my things, double-checked that nothing was left behind, and started the car. The engine roared to life, and I felt a momentary relief as I pulled onto the dirt path leading back to the main road. But as I drove, I noticed movement in the shadows along the tree line. A figure standing perfectly still, watching. I forced myself to keep driving, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't look back again until I reached the main road, where civilization slowly returned. Fences, houses, signs of human presence. By the time I reached a gas station 20 miles away, I was shaking, exhausted, and deeply aware of how close I had come to danger. I called the local authorities and explained my situation, giving them the details of the cabin location, the footprints, and the sounds I had heard. They assured me they would check the area, but they warned me that remote cabins were sometimes targets for trespassers or criminals who knew no one was around. I felt a mix of relief and anger, relief for escaping safely, and anger that my peaceful retreat had been violated. It took me weeks to stop feeling the lingering fear. Even after returning home, the memory of those footsteps, the scattered firewood, and the shadowy figure stayed with me. But over time, I also realized something important. I had survived by staying calm, assessing the situation, and acting decisively. I had relied on my instincts, my planning, and my preparedness, and those things had saved me. I never returned to that cabin, and I never sought such complete isolation again. But I also didn't let fear control me. I learned that even in beautiful, peaceful places, there could be real danger, and being aware, prepared, and cautious was not paranoia. It was survival. The experience changed the way I approached life in subtle ways. I became more attentive, more cautious, and more appreciative of the presence of others. I realized that sometimes true peace wasn't about being completely alone. It was about being safe, even in solitude, and knowing that preparedness was the most powerful form of protection. I had planned this trip for months, telling myself it was a much-needed break from the city, from the constant noise, from the endless responsibilities I carried like invisible chains. I had found a cabin online, tucked deep in the mountains, far from any road that would see more than a handful of cars in a day, if even that. The pictures were perfect. A modest wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch that overlooked a clearing surrounded by dense forest. It looked isolated, quiet, exactly what I wanted. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The drive up had been long and winding, narrow roads cutting through thick pines, the sunlight slowly dimming as the day progressed. By the time I reached the cabin, the shadows of the trees had stretched long across the dirt driveway. The cabin was as the pictures had shown, small, sturdy, almost rustic, with signs of life inside, but not the constant city kind of life. I could see the faint trail of smoke from the chimney, and I felt a small thrill of comfort. Someone had been here recently. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood, old blankets, and a faint trace of smoke. It had basic furnishings: a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a fridge that looked modern enough to function properly, a table with 4 chairs, and a couch that looked firm but not uncomfortable. I unpacked my bag, setting aside my work clothes, my laptop, my phone charger. I had planned for this weekend to be a detox, to be away from screens and calls. After unpacking, I went outside to explore the clearing. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, pine, and the faint tang of something metallic, maybe a distant stream or a rusted old metal sign somewhere down the hill. The forest surrounded the cabin completely, so dense I could barely see beyond the nearest trunks. I walked around the clearing, noting the trees, the underbrush, the uneven patches of grass. I found a small path that led into the woods. I told myself I would check it out the next day. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, sat on the couch with a blanket over my legs, and just listened. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, and I could hear twigs snapping far off in the darkness. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was persistent, rhythmic, almost deliberate. My pulse quickened a little, but I shook my head and told myself I was being paranoid. I was alone, yes, but alone in the woods wasn't automatically dangerous. I went to bed early, letting the fire die down to embers. The first few hours were calm. The occasional crack of a branch, the whisper of wind, the distant hoot of an owl. But around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that stopped my blood cold. Footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, measured, deliberate. I froze under my blanket, straining my ears. The steps moved along the perimeter, circling, stopping, starting again. I could hear something scrape against the wooden porch. My stomach churned. I wanted to convince myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, but the weight of the steps, the deliberate pacing, they weren't random. They were too steady. I sat up quietly, listening. My mind raced through options, but panic didn't hit me yet. Fear was steady, cold, a slow, sinking pressure in my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought for peace of mind, creeping toward the window. Peering through the curtains, I could see the porch empty, dim shadows stretching across the cabin's front. Then I heard a voice, or at least something close to a voice. It wasn't clear, muffled by the walls and distance, but there was a whisper, almost like someone muttering to themselves. I swallowed hard, my heart thumping. I told myself to stay calm, to not give away my presence. Whoever or whatever it was might leave if they didn't see me. I grabbed my phone to check for signal. None, of course. Deep in the mountains, the nearest bar of coverage would be miles away, and I knew it. The footsteps moved again, circling the cabin's side, toward the back. I could see the faint glimmer of a flashlight beam through the trees. I froze, holding my breath, waiting. It stopped, the beam pointing directly at the window I had been watching from. My heart jumped, and I ducked down, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles whitened. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The steps finally receded, fading into the darkness. I didn't move until the sound of movement had completely disappeared. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been a hunter? A hiker? A trespasser with worse intentions? I didn't know. I realized I couldn't stay in the cabin that night, not safely. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a corner, bat in hand, listening to every sound. The wind, the trees, the distant call of animals. It all felt threatening now. By sunrise, the forest seemed slightly less menacing, but only slightly. I made a plan. I would leave the cabin, but slowly, carefully, and I would make it to the nearest main road without being noticed. After packing the essentials, water, a small backpack, a first aid kit, I slowly opened the cabin door. The air was cold, crisp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and earth. I stepped out, trying to be as quiet as possible, moving in the shadows, keeping the cabin in sight. The forest seemed alive, every crack of a branch making me flinch. I stuck to areas with cover, moving carefully toward a faint path I had noticed earlier. I kept walking, following the path as best I could. It twisted and turned, sometimes leading me into thick underbrush that clawed at my legs and clothes. At one point, I thought I saw a figure in the shadows, but it was probably just a tree trunk, a trick of the light. I didn't dare stop to check. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the fear pushing me forward was stronger. Hours passed, or at least that's how long it felt. Eventually, the trees began to thin, the forest giving way to a narrow dirt road. Relief flooded me, but I stayed cautious, moving along the road until I reached a bend where I could see lights in the distance. A small gas station, maybe half a mile ahead. I kept moving, faster now, my fear fueling my steps. Finally, I reached the gas station. The attendant looked up at me with concern, noticing my disheveled state, my dirt-streaked clothes, my trembling hands. I didn't speak. I just collapsed onto a chair inside, trying to catch my breath. I explained, slowly, what had happened, how someone or something had been outside my cabin, circling, watching. The attendant listened, nodded, and offered to call the authorities. I stayed there until the police arrived, giving them the cabin's location, the layout, and any details I could remember about the figure I had seen or the sounds I had heard. They promised to investigate, to check the cabin, but I didn't want to go back. The idea of stepping foot there again, even in daylight, filled me with dread. Weeks later, I learned that someone had indeed been living in the woods near the cabin. A man, transient, with a history of breaking into isolated homes. They had found evidence of his presence. Small campsites, makeshift shelters, food caches, discarded clothing. The police believed he had been observing the cabin for days, maybe weeks, waiting for someone to arrive. He had fled once he realized the cabin was empty, but they eventually tracked him down and arrested him. I never returned to that part of the woods. I sold my cabin reservation immediately and avoided mountain trips for months after. The experience left a mark, an understanding that isolation carries risks that no picture, no description, no promise of peace can fully convey. But I survived, and I survived because I stayed alert, because I trusted my instincts, because I didn't let fear paralyze me entirely. I learned to respect the wilderness, to respect its unpredictability, and to respect the people who might be hiding inside it, watching, waiting. The ending was clear, painfully simple. Isolation can be dangerous, but awareness and preparation can save you. I rebuilt my confidence slowly, traveling in groups, avoiding remote cabins alone, but the fear never fully left me. It was a shadow I carried, a reminder of that night when every sound could have meant the difference between life and death. And I carried it with me carefully, like a lesson etched in muscle and memory, a reminder that being prepared, observant, and cautious matters far more than convenience or desire for solitude. Even now, years later, I avoid empty cabins. I avoid dark paths in the woods. I check every sound, every shadow, every movement, because one night in the mountains taught me that danger doesn't need magic. Danger can be real, human, and terrifyingly close. And surviving it is all about choices, instincts, and attention to the smallest details. I had always wanted to spend a week alone in the woods, away from cities, phones, and the noise of other people. The idea of a small cabin tucked in the deep forest felt like freedom, a place to just exist without obligations or schedules. I found the cabin online through a listing that claimed it was remote, secluded, and peaceful. The pictures were modest but inviting. A small wooden structure with a stone fireplace, a creek nearby, and trees that surrounded it so densely that sunlight barely reached the ground. I packed my car with everything I thought I might need: food, water, blankets, batteries, a first aid kit, tools, and enough firewood to last a week. I left the city behind early in the morning, excited but calm, thinking I was going to enjoy a quiet week to myself. The drive was long and winding, the road narrowing into a dirt path that twisted around hills, crossed small creeks, and dipped into shadows under the dense trees. The last few miles were rough, and I had to drive slowly, careful not to damage my car. When I finally saw the cabin, relief and excitement washed over me. It looked exactly as in the pictures. I parked in front, unloaded my supplies, and went inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood and old smoke, but it was clean, and I felt immediately at ease. The cabin had a small kitchen area, a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, and a lofted sleeping area. There was a water source, a small tap connected to a cistern, and a wood stove. The isolation was complete. No neighbors, no roads leading nearby, just the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional bird. The first day passed pleasantly. I explored the area around the cabin, walked along the creek, collected firewood, and started a fire in the fireplace for the evening. The forest felt alive but not threatening. I felt small among the trees, but I also felt alive in a way I never had in the city. At night, the forest sounded different. The wind rattled branches, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. I lay in the loft listening, but there was nothing that felt dangerous, just the wilderness doing what it does. The second day was uneventful too. I stayed mostly in the cabin, chopping wood, reading, and preparing meals. I began to notice small things, little signs of life around the cabin. Footprints of deer, tracks from raccoons near the water source, the way certain birds visited at specific times of day. I felt alone, but in a comfortable way. That night, I made sure to secure the cabin, locking the doors and closing the shutters. I started to feel a creeping sense of respect for the forest, how vast and old it was, and how fragile a human felt within it. On the third day, I went for a longer hike. The path I took led up a small hill, giving a view of the surrounding forest. It was beautiful, a sea of green punctuated by shadows. I walked further than I had planned, losing track of time. By the time I decided to turn back, the light was fading. I could feel the temperature dropping, and the forest was becoming silent in a way that felt tense. Birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed quieter. I hurried down the hill, retracing my steps, but the forest seemed different now, darker, more confusing. I found myself double-checking landmarks, the creek, the moss on the trees, familiar rocks, but things didn't feel right. I finally reached the cabin just as darkness fully set in. I locked the doors and immediately started a fire in the fireplace, trying to calm my nerves. I realized for the first time how alone I truly was. There were no other humans, no cars passing by, just me and the trees surrounding the cabin like silent watchers. The fourth day began with a chill in the air. Overnight, the wind had grown stronger, and when I looked out the window, the trees swayed aggressively. I decided to stay inside, tending to the fire, organizing supplies, and trying to relax. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed that something was off. I had stacked the firewood neatly outside, and now some of it was scattered. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but then I noticed more disturbances. A section of my small vegetable garden had been dug up, and footprints in the soft earth suggested something large had been there. My heart began to race. I went outside cautiously, examining the tracks. They were too large for a dog or a raccoon. They were the size of a human boot, but the shape was odd, elongated in a way that suggested heavy boots. Panic didn't set in yet, but a tight knot formed in my stomach. I felt watched. The fifth night was the worst. I had gone to bed early, trying to calm myself with the logic that the forest was indifferent to my presence. But at around 2 in the morning, I was awoken by a low, deliberate knocking on the cabin door. 3 slow, heavy knocks, then a pause, then another 3. My heart nearly stopped. I lay there, staring at the darkened room, listening as my mind raced. Who would be out here at this hour? The nearest road was at least a mile away. My phone had no signal. I thought about opening the door to yell, but fear rooted me to the bed. The knocking continued for a few more minutes, then stopped. The silence afterward was suffocating. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the first light of dawn came, I found myself checking the perimeter of the cabin. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Nothing, just the forest quiet as ever. Over the next 2 days, I remained vigilant. I didn't leave the cabin except for brief moments during the day, always armed with a long stick and an eye constantly scanning the tree line. Each rustle, each broken branch made me jump. I began hearing faint sounds of movement around the cabin even during daylight. It was subtle at first, just a step here, a branch snapping there, but it became increasingly obvious that someone or something was circling the cabin. I found small disturbances in the dirt and leaves around the perimeter. Not animal tracks, too heavy, too deliberate, often overlapping in strange patterns. I began to dread the night, knowing whatever it was, it might be more than a prankster or lost hiker. The weight of solitude, the fear of being trapped in the cabin with no way to call for help, pressed on me relentlessly. On the 7th night, I decided I had to act. I couldn't spend another night in constant terror. I gathered supplies, food, water, and the little cash I had, planning to hike out the next morning at first light. I double-checked the windows and doors, knowing I had to leave everything else behind. I couldn't afford to wait for rescue because no one knew I was here. I resolved to leave the cabin and reach the nearest road, hoping to flag down a car or find a phone. That night, the wind was stronger, and the forest seemed darker than ever. The scratching noises returned, louder, closer. I stayed awake, alert, waiting for the right moment to leave. At dawn, I stepped outside cautiously. The air was damp and cold, and fog clung low to the ground. I saw fresh footprints in the mud, too close to the cabin. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. I followed a path I had marked earlier, a narrow trail leading toward the road. The footprints continued, circling around me, always appearing just ahead or behind. My heart pounded in my chest. I moved faster, occasionally glancing back to see vague shapes among the trees. The further I walked, the more I realized the person or people had been tracking me for days. It became clear this wasn't a random encounter. It was deliberate. Every step was a calculated risk, but I knew staying meant certain terror. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the dense forest onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me in waves. I saw the first car in what felt like forever, a delivery truck coming slowly down the road. I waved frantically, catching the driver's attention. He stopped, and I climbed in without hesitation, hands trembling. I explained as best I could, the fear still raw, the adrenaline fading slowly. We drove to the nearest town, where I contacted the police and finally felt the weight of constant fear begin to lift. They found the cabin later, abandoned, but nothing else. No one was ever caught. The footprints and signs of someone being there remained a mystery, but that didn't matter to me. I had escaped, unharmed, and the forest, the cabin, and the isolation were behind me. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the memory. The scratching noises, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. But I survived. I had gone alone, afraid, and I had come out the other side, alive and cautious, wiser about the real dangers that solitude in the wilderness could hide. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Life in the city had become unbearably hectic, and the constant noise and pressure of work, traffic, and people had started to wear me down. I wanted somewhere quiet, isolated, where I could breathe and feel something resembling peace. That's how I ended up booking a small, remote cabin in the mountains, miles away from any town or major road. The cabin was advertised as being completely secluded, with only a dirt road leading to it and surrounded entirely by dense forest. The pictures showed a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, a little porch, and a creek nearby. It seemed perfect, peaceful, and quiet. I didn't want perfection. I wanted emptiness, silence, and a sense of being completely alone. I arrived late in the afternoon. The road had been longer and rougher than I expected. My little car groaned over rocks and potholes, and I had to keep a careful eye on the narrow path that curved around steep cliffs and deep drops. The trees towered overhead, so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. At some points, branches scraped the sides of my car, leaving streaks on the paint. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the cabin, partially hidden by a curtain of pine trees. The sight of it was almost comforting. It looked small but solid, sturdy, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney. I parked on the uneven patch of dirt in front of the cabin and stepped out. The air smelled like wet pine and damp earth. It was cooler than I expected for that time of year, and a breeze stirred the leaves. I took a deep breath, trying to feel that sense of calm I had come for. I had brought everything I needed for a week alone: food, water, firewood, a small camping stove, blankets, and a lantern. My phone had spotty reception at best, but I had promised myself I wouldn't be checking it much anyway. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. The interior smelled of wood and dust, and it felt colder than the outside air. There was a small living area with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with basic supplies, and a loft above that I assumed was the sleeping area. The windows were small but gave a view of the forest. I set my things down, unpacked my food, and stacked firewood by the stove. I decided to start a fire to warm the place up. Lighting it took longer than I expected. The wood was damp, but eventually the flames began to catch, and the warmth slowly spread through the cabin. As the evening deepened, the forest around the cabin grew darker, almost oppressive in its quiet. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of the creek. Every now and then, a branch would snap in the woods, and my pulse would quicken. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, animals, or the uneven ground, but my stomach tightened every time the sound came closer or seemed sharper. Night fell fully, and I sat in the glow of the fire, eating a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. The darkness outside the windows felt like it pressed against the glass, a living thing waiting for me to make a mistake. I had intended to sleep early, but the silence made sleep impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, seemed exaggerated. I decided to light the lantern and examine the cabin thoroughly. It was old but well-maintained. The floorboards were solid, though they groaned under my weight. The loft had a mattress with blankets, clean but stiff. The kitchen cupboards held canned food, a few utensils, and a small pot. I checked the doors and windows to make sure they were locked or secure. Everything seemed normal. Yet, despite that, a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched, though I was alone. I tried to sleep, lying in the loft, but every noise seemed magnified. The creek sounded louder in the night, like water rushing closer than it was. The wind moaned through the trees, and the branches scraped the cabin walls, making a sound like fingernails on wood. My imagination began to play tricks on me. I thought I saw movement outside the window, shadows shifting between the trees. My rational mind told me it was impossible, but my body responded as if it were true. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the ground outside. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy. My heart pounded and I froze, listening. The sound stopped abruptly. I strained my ears, hearing only the normal night noises: the wind, the creek, and the occasional distant animal call. I forced myself to believe it was a branch or an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I had never heard a bear move like that. I stayed awake, listening, gripping a thick stick I had found by the firewood. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that I had nothing valuable for anyone to steal and that I was in the middle of nowhere. That evening, I secured the cabin more carefully. I double-checked the locks, barricaded the door with a chair, and kept a knife close. I sat by the fireplace, trying to calm my thoughts, but every sound outside made me tense. The wind howled differently now, almost like it was moving around something, and small cracks in the wood walls sounded like footsteps. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake most of the night, listening, waiting. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes moving outside between the trees. I kept reminding myself it could be animals, but the footprints earlier told a different story. I was not entirely alone. On the 5th day, the tension reached a peak. I woke early to the sound of something heavy dragging along the cabin walls. I froze, holding my breath. The dragging stopped abruptly, and the forest went silent again. I went to the window and looked outside. There was nothing there, only the shadows of the trees swaying. But my firewood pile was almost entirely gone. The logs dragged into the shadows. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever was out there was not timid. It had been close enough to touch the cabin, and it had gone through my supplies. Fear replaced curiosity. I realized I had no way to call for help. My phone had no signal. No one knew I was there. I was trapped in the middle of the forest with a potential intruder who was watching and learning. I spent the day preparing. I made a pile of tools near the door: an axe, a hammer, and a knife. I set traps with rocks and sticks near the windows to make noise if someone tried to get inside. I rationed my food, keeping a small portion for emergencies. I stayed inside mostly, moving only when necessary, constantly checking the perimeter. By nightfall, I could feel exhaustion pressing down, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scraping along the walls, and I could swear I saw shadows moving between the trees. Each time, my heart would hammer, and I would hold my breath, hoping it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The 6th day was worse. Early in the morning, I heard a loud crash outside. I ran to the window and saw that part of the porch had been damaged. Someone or something had tried to force entry. My stomach turned to ice. I realized that I had to act. I couldn't stay passive. I gathered the remaining tools, barricaded the door further, and made a plan. If anyone came in, I would need to be ready. I also decided to leave the cabin eventually, but only when I had daylight and a clear path. The night came, and the wind carried the sounds of movement again. I stayed awake the entire night, knife in hand, ears straining for the slightest noise. Sleep was impossible. Fear had replaced all comfort. Every crack of a branch, every scurrying sound, made me flinch. At dawn on the 7th day, I woke to absolute silence. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed almost empty. Cautiously, I looked out the window. The firewood pile was gone. The porch was damaged further. I could see fresh footprints around the cabin. Someone had been there overnight. My fear was at its peak. I realized I could not stay another night. I packed the essentials: water, a few canned goods, my backpack, and my tools. I chose a path I had scouted before, along a stream that I knew led to a road a few miles away. Every step was careful, deliberate. I kept my knife ready, and my eyes constantly scanned the forest. I tried to move quietly, but my heart was in my throat with every sound. Around midday, I reached a point where I thought I heard voices, distant but real. Relief washed over me. Following the sound, I stumbled onto a narrow dirt road. Soon, I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed. They called the authorities, and I explained my situation. By evening, law enforcement arrived at the cabin. They found signs of someone trespassing and evidence that the intruder had been close to entering the cabin repeatedly. They said it could have been a person hiding in the forest, observing me for days. No one was caught, but I was safe now. In the end, I never returned to that cabin. I realized how fragile human safety can be in the wilderness and how quickly fear can take over when you are alone and vulnerable. The experience left me shaken, hyper-aware of surroundings, and much more cautious. But it also left me with a strange respect for the forest and its power. Even now, I can picture that cabin, the swaying trees, the quiet creek, and the shadows that moved just beyond the firelight. I survived because I stayed alert, planned carefully, and respected the danger I could not fully see. The memory remains vivid, a reminder that isolation in the woods is beautiful, but it can quickly become terrifying if someone, or something, decides to intrude. I remember the first time I drove up to that cabin, alone, with a sense of anxious excitement mixed with fatigue. It was the last week of October, and the road leading up to it was a narrow, winding dirt track, lined with trees that had already shed most of their leaves. The tires crunched over gravel and scattered leaves as I ascended, the car's headlights cutting through the early evening fog. I had chosen this cabin for its isolation, its promise of solitude, thinking I could spend a week away from everything, just me and the woods. I had checked it online, made sure it had all the basics, running water, a small kitchen, and heat. What I hadn't accounted for was how eerily quiet it would be when I arrived. The moment I opened the car door, the sound of the wind rustling through bare branches was almost deafening in its emptiness. The cabin itself was small and made of rough-hewn logs, with a slanted roof and a single chimney. The smell of damp wood and old pine hit me as I stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the last golden rays of sunlight streaming through grimy windows. I set my bags down and began to unpack slowly, taking in every detail. The sagging shelves, the old, creaking floorboards, the fireplace that hadn't been used in a while. I made a mental note to check the firewood outside. Even though I had packed extra blankets, the cabin had a chill to it, one that no thermostat could fully remove. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, heating water for tea, and watched the flames dance across the logs. The forest outside was a black void, the trees swaying under the occasional gust of wind, branches scraping against each other. I remember feeling a strange mixture of calm and unease. Alone in the dark, every tiny sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin's wooden frame, the soft scratching of branches against the roof. I had brought my laptop to write, but after an hour, I put it aside and stared into the fire, noticing how the shadows of the logs shifted on the walls. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was shallow, broken by every minor noise outside. I woke up to the sound of a branch tapping against a window. I convinced myself it was just the wind and went back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check the firewood and gather more for the night. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every rustle, every crack of twigs under unseen footsteps made me look over my shoulder. I reassured myself I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I spent the day preparing for the week ahead, chopping some firewood, cleaning the cabin, and walking around the small clearing that surrounded it. The further I walked into the forest, the denser the trees became, until I could barely see past a few feet. I found small animal tracks in the soft earth, probably deer or foxes, but the way they twisted and turned unnaturally made me hesitate. Still, I told myself it was normal. This was the wilderness. Wildlife was expected. On the third night, the wind picked up. I had just finished eating and had started a fire when I noticed movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then I realized it was too large, too deliberate. I watched, frozen, as a figure moved just beyond the reach of the firelight. I convinced myself it was a trick of shadows, my eyes playing games in the darkness. Yet the sense of being watched intensified. The scratching noises at the cabin's exterior, which I had dismissed as animals, seemed more frequent, more intentional. My stomach churned, and I kept imagining the worst-case scenarios. Someone lost in the woods finding the cabin, or worse, someone following me here intentionally. I didn't leave the cabin again that night. I closed the curtains, locked the doors, and stayed near the fireplace, feeling the weight of isolation like a physical pressure on my chest. By the fourth day, my paranoia had grown. I heard footsteps outside in the middle of the night, heavy and slow, stopping abruptly at points. The sound of twigs snapping made me jump each time, and I found myself clutching a fireplace poker, staring at the windows. Every noise, the wind, the trees, the small animals, suddenly seemed like it could be something else. I began checking the locks repeatedly, pacing the cabin, making sure nothing was left unguarded. The rational part of me knew it was probably nothing, but instinct screamed otherwise. I realized I hadn't seen anyone else in the entire forest. No hikers, no hunters, no cars passing by. I was completely isolated, and that realization settled over me like a heavy fog. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping movement and daylight would ease my mind. I packed water, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight. The forest was dense, the paths uneven and covered in loose soil and fallen leaves. I walked carefully, noting the signs of wildlife, broken branches, tracks in the mud, but nothing that seemed threatening. After a while, I found a small clearing near the creek. The sound of running water was soothing, and I took a long drink from my bottle, listening to the water splash over rocks. The forest seemed peaceful in the daylight. The night's fears seemed like a product of my imagination. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to set. I started a fire and prepared dinner again, trying to distract myself with simple routines. As darkness fell, however, the unsettling feeling returned. The forest seemed alive in a way I had never noticed before. Every movement of leaves or crack of branches made me tense. I kept checking the windows, the doors, the surroundings, even walking outside to make sure nothing had changed. By the time the night deepened, I was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. On the third night, things escalated. Around 11:30, I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time it was closer. I froze, straining to see through the darkness outside the window. The fire had dwindled, and the cabin was bathed in shadows. I grabbed a small hatchet I had brought for firewood and crept to the door, trying to hear any additional noises. The scraping continued, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. My pulse raced and my hands shook. I told myself not to panic, not to act irrationally. Whoever or whatever was out there could not see me if I stayed still. Hours passed like this. I didn't sleep. I stayed in one corner of the cabin, listening, watching, ready to defend myself. By morning, I was drained, my mind on edge. I decided to take action rather than wait for the terror to escalate. I couldn't rely on the hope that nothing was out there. I walked around the cabin, checking for footprints, broken branches, or anything unusual. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. Faint tire tracks leading into the forest and ending abruptly near the cabin. They were fresh, likely from the night before. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here, close to the cabin. Not an animal, not a natural sound. A human. Panic mixed with determination. I realized I needed to leave. I packed my essentials quickly, leaving the fire burning to avoid drawing attention if the person returned. I had no choice but to drive back down the dirt road. I kept my eyes on the tree-line as I loaded the car, making as little noise as possible. Every rustle, every movement in the forest made me tense. I gripped the keys tightly, ready to sprint if needed. I started the car and moved slowly at first, listening. The forest seemed silent, almost expectant. Once I hit the main path, I accelerated, my hands tight on the wheel. The road was treacherous, full of potholes, rocks, and fallen branches, but I didn't care. I had to get to civilization. The drive took longer than I expected, but the thought of being watched, of someone possibly following me, pushed me forward. Hours later, I reached the nearest town. Exhausted, I parked at a small motel and sat in the car, heart pounding. I called the local police, explaining the situation. They took my statement seriously and said they would check the area, though they admitted remote cabins were difficult to patrol. They confirmed that in recent weeks, there had been reports of people camping illegally and sometimes harassing or robbing those staying in isolated cabins. Relief mixed with fear as I realized how close I had come to a serious danger. The police later found evidence near the cabin. Footprints, a makeshift campsite, and tire tracks leading to the forest. No one was caught, but the investigation confirmed my fears. I never returned to that cabin. The experience left me shaken, hyper-aware of the dangers of isolation, and I realized that real fear didn't come from ghosts or monsters. It came from the knowledge that someone could be there, unseen, watching, and that nature's silence could hide a very human threat. I eventually found another cabin for a later trip, one closer to a patrol route, with neighbors nearby and better access to roads. It was still quiet, still remote, but I felt safe enough to relax. I learned that fear is not about darkness, wind, or creaking floors. It's about the unknown presence of others, about isolation in a place where help may never arrive. And I carry that lesson with me every time I choose to seek solitude again. More careful, more prepared, and aware that sometimes the scariest stories are entirely real and entirely human. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the constant noise, the honking, the crowd, and the endless deadlines was irresistible. My cabin was tucked away in a dense stretch of forest, about 3 hours' drive from the nearest town. It was one of those old wooden cabins, with a steep roof covered in moss, a chimney that hadn't been used in a long time, and a small porch that looked out onto a clearing surrounded by thick trees. I had booked it online, mostly based on photos and a few reviews from people who mentioned the quiet and the seclusion. I liked the idea that I would be completely alone, with no distractions and no obligations. It was going to be just me and the forest for a few days. The drive there was long but peaceful. The roads narrowed as I got closer, twisting through hills and thick woods, with no gas stations or stores for miles. The sun was starting to set when I finally turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin. By the time I parked, the sky had deepened into a mix of dark blue and orange. The air smelled of pine, wet leaves, and something earthy I couldn't name. I carried my backpack, which had food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small camping stove. The cabin was small but sturdy. The wood creaked slightly under my weight as I stepped onto the porch, and I could see that it had been some time since it was last occupied. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The floorboards were uneven, and the walls had marks from years of use. The furniture was sparse. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed pushed against the wall, and a wood stove that looked functional but old. The windows were large and let in enough light to see, though as the sun set, shadows crept across the room. I set down my bag and took a deep breath. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, the kind that always comes when you're in a place completely removed from anything familiar. I spent the next hour exploring the cabin. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I opened the small kitchen cupboards, found some old dishes, and set out the things I had brought. I filled the kettle with water from the tap and started a small fire in the stove to warm the room. The wind rustled the trees outside, and I could hear occasional bird calls, distant and lonely. There was something profoundly silent about the place, a stillness that was both calming and slightly unnerving. As night fell, I prepared a simple dinner, a few canned vegetables and some rice. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows that danced along the walls. I ate slowly, listening to the forest, letting my mind settle into the quiet. After eating, I washed up and got ready for bed. I had brought a flashlight, but I also left the cabin's small lantern on the table, casting a soft, flickering glow. The bed was firm, the mattress thin, but it would be enough for a few nights. I lay down, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I drifted off to sleep feeling safe, or at least I thought I did. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound. It was faint, but it made my heart rate pick up immediately. At first, I thought it was an animal outside, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the sound didn't match anything I had heard before. It was a scraping noise, soft but deliberate, like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze under the covers, straining my ears. The sound continued intermittently, coming from outside the cabin. I told myself it was probably the wind, or maybe a branch rubbing against the wall, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I got up quietly and walked to the window. The moon was full, casting pale light over the clearing. The forest was still, silent except for the occasional creak of trees swaying in the wind. I didn't see anything unusual at first, But then I noticed footprints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. They weren't human, not exactly. They were wide, and the shape was odd, almost like a cross between a human foot and something else. My stomach tightened. I didn't know what it was, but I had never seen anything like it. I backed away from the window, feeling a cold sweat run down my back. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a wild animal, maybe I had imagined the shape. I told myself to go back to bed, to ignore it. But sleep was impossible. Every small sound, every creak of the cabin, made me tense. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the night, waiting for something, anything to happen. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I could swear I heard whispers in the distance, carried by the rustling leaves. I told myself it was the wind again, that my mind was playing tricks on me. By morning, I was exhausted. The sun rose, and the forest seemed less threatening in daylight. I went outside to inspect the clearing more closely. The footprints were still there, fresh and muddy. They led into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I couldn't identify what had made them. I spent the day keeping watch, making small repairs to the cabin, stacking firewood, and trying to distract myself. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I turned my head, I imagined movement just beyond my vision. On the second night, the sounds returned, louder this time. Scraping, shifting, and now something that sounded like breathing, low and steady. I stayed up, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness outside. The trees cast long, twisted shadows, and I could see movement in the periphery, always just out of focus. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and broad, but when I blinked, it was gone. My mind raced. I considered leaving immediately, driving back to town, but the nearest road was still miles away. I wasn't sure I could make it in the dark, especially if whatever was out there was still around. The next day, I decided I needed to gather evidence, something tangible that would explain what was happening. I set up my camera on a tripod near the edge of the clearing, aimed at the path leading into the forest. I hoped to catch whatever it was on film. I spent the day maintaining the cabin and staying alert, moving only when necessary, keeping my ears open for any unusual sounds. The forest was unnervingly quiet at times, and when I heard movement, it was always just beyond the clearing. That night, the sounds escalated. Scraping, snapping branches, the low breathing again. This time, I stayed near the window with my camera, watching. Around midnight, something appeared in the clearing. It was massive, hunched low, moving with slow, deliberate steps. I couldn't see it clearly, but the shape was monstrous. It moved toward the cabin, stopping at the edge of the trees. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My hands shook as I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the figure. The light caught its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. It let out a low, guttural sound. Not a growl exactly, more like a deep, resonant hiss. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't a human. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was dangerous. I remembered the bear warnings in the area, but this didn't match any bear I had ever seen. It was too large, too deliberate, too intelligent. I stayed frozen, watching as it circled the edge of the clearing, sniffing, testing, waiting. My survival instincts kicked in. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. I needed a plan. The first light, I packed my things. I took only the essentials: food, water, my flashlight, my camera, and a small knife. I didn't dare leave in the dark, but I also couldn't stay. I decided to follow the river trail that ran near the cabin, hoping it would lead me to a main road. I moved slowly, staying low, keeping my eyes on the forest. I heard it behind me, following at a distance, the branches snapping under its weight. My pace quickened, but I stayed silent, careful not to draw attention. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, I saw a clearing with tire tracks, a logging road. I ran to it, waving my arms to signal any passing vehicles. Finally, a truck appeared, and I managed to stop it. The driver was shocked by my appearance. and I explained as best I could without seeming completely insane. He called the local authorities, who came out to investigate. They found tracks around the cabin, large, unlike any bear or known animal in the area. They couldn't identify it, but they confirmed it was dangerous and advised me never to return. After that, I went back to the city. I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The sounds, the figure, the feeling of being hunted. I left the footage from my camera with a wildlife expert, who confirmed that it showed something unprecedented. An enormous, unknown predator moving with intelligence and patience. The authorities never captured it, and locals spoke of similar sightings in the region, though nothing had been confirmed. I never returned to that forest. I still think about it, about the isolation, the quiet that was anything but peaceful, and the presence I could feel watching me, waiting for me. I learned something important there. Nature is unpredictable, and the things that inhabit it are not always as we expect. I survived, but it changed me. I carry that awareness with me now, the knowledge that there are things beyond our understanding, waiting silently in the dark, patient and alive. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend in the cabin for months. Work had been exhausting, and the constant noise of the city had worn me down. I imagined days of isolation in the forest, breathing in the cold, fresh air, walking through the thick pines, and sitting by the fireplace with nothing but my thoughts. I packed carefully. Extra blankets, a first aid kit, food that could last, bottled water, batteries for the flashlight, and my old camping knife. I had even brought a small solar charger for my phone, thinking I might need it for emergencies. The drive to the cabin was long. I left early in the morning before sunrise so I could arrive before dark. The roads narrowed as I left the main highway, twisting through hills that grew steeper and more wooded. My car's headlights barely reached the trees on either side, and I could feel the isolation pressing against me even while I was still in the vehicle. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to gravel, and I had to slow down to keep from sliding on loose rocks. The GPS signal flickered, dropping me into dead zones, but I knew the general area from a map I had printed weeks before. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The forest cast long shadows, and the air smelled of wet leaves and decaying wood. The cabin was small and simple, built from rough-hewn logs, with a sloping roof and a stone chimney. It had clearly been empty for some time. The wood was dark with age, and moss had started creeping over the steps. I parked nearby, unloaded my gear, and went inside. The interior smelled of dust and damp. Sunlight filtered through the grime on the windows, casting dim light across the floorboards. The furniture was basic. A wooden table, a few chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a wood stove. There was a stack of firewood beside the stove, which I was glad to see because I had brought only matches, not a lighter. I checked the cabin carefully, making sure all windows and doors were intact. Everything seemed quiet and undisturbed. For a while, I felt relief. The solitude was exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my gear and set up my small living space. I prepared a simple dinner from canned beans and bread, then sat near the stove, warming my hands. The sun had fully disappeared by now, leaving the forest outside black. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds settling for the night and the occasional snap of twigs in the trees. I knew wildlife was nearby, but the thought didn't bother me yet. Around 10 p.m., I went to bed, leaving a small lamp on in the corner. Sleep came slowly, my mind still buzzing with the sights and sounds of the forest. Then I heard it. At first, it was subtle, a soft thump against the side of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. A few seconds later, another thump, then a scraping sound along the wall. My heart started racing. I reminded myself it was probably an animal. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I had read enough survival guides to know not to panic. I got out of bed quietly, grabbing my flashlight. I swept the beam across the room and then toward the window. Nothing. The thumping stopped. I stayed up for hours after that, listening. Each little noise in the forest made me tense, my mind imagining every possible scenario. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and damp. The trees towered over me, and I moved cautiously, aware that the solitude of the forest could turn dangerous quickly. I noticed broken branches and deep tracks in the mud that looked large and human-like. I tried to rationalize it, probably hikers or hunters, but a small unease lingered. I returned to the cabin in the afternoon and set about preparing firewood, making sure I could keep the stove burning through the night. As night approached again, the cabin felt different. The first night had been unsettling, but this one carried a heavier sense of isolation. Around 8 p.m., I heard the thumping again. It was louder this time, closer. My stomach twisted. I double-checked the locks, even though they seemed fine. Then I heard something new, a faint, dragging sound across the floor outside. It stopped and started again, irregular, as if someone, or something, was moving carefully, trying not to be noticed. I decided to go outside to look. I grabbed my knife and a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The night was cold, the air thick with moisture. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the trees, but I saw nothing. Then, I noticed a figure in the distance, half hidden by the darkness. My pulse jumped. It was a human shape, hunched, moving slowly toward the cabin. I ran back inside and locked the door. I crouched behind the table, knife in hand. My mind raced. I considered my options. I could try to escape, but my car was far, and the forest was dark and unfamiliar. Calling the police seemed logical, but my phone signal was weak, and I wasn't sure if it would hold. I realized I might have to defend myself if the person or persons tried to enter. Hours passed with tension building. Every sound outside made me jump. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional thump against the cabin walls. I kept the fire burning and tried to make noise inside occasionally, knocking on the table or banging a chair to create the impression that someone was alert. The sounds outside never fully stopped, but they moved away gradually, fading as if whoever was out there had given up. I didn't sleep that night either. The following morning, I inspected the perimeter. I found deep footprints around the cabin, large and irregular, as if someone had wandered near the windows and porch. I also noticed marks on the wood, scratches, and small dents. My unease grew. I realized the area wasn't safe, that this wasn't just a random hiker or animal. Whoever had been outside had been close enough to see inside, maybe even to watch me. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin. I stacked firewood against the doors, reinforced windows with chairs and tables, and kept my knife and a heavy metal rod close. I didn't leave the cabin, only peering outside occasionally to check the surrounding forest. Each time, the sense of isolation intensified, pressing in from all sides. The sunlight did little to ease my nerves, as if the forest itself had become an oppressive presence. That night was the worst. Around 9 p.m., the sounds began again, louder, more deliberate. Thumps against the walls, scraping along the wood. I could hear faint whispers or murmurs carried on the wind, though I couldn't make out any words. I stayed crouched, listening, gripping my knife. Hours passed. My body ached from tension, my mind swirling with fear and exhaustion. The forest seemed alive, every sound amplified. Eventually, the noises moved away again, leaving a heavy silence. I stayed awake until dawn, knowing that sleep might not be safe. When morning came, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed essentials quickly: food, water, my flashlight, knife, and a small blanket, and prepared to leave. I moved carefully, checking the forest before stepping onto the path. It was wet and muddy from overnight rain, making footprints easy to see. I followed the path back toward the gravel road, keeping my eyes on the tree-line. Halfway to the road, I noticed fresh footprints alongside mine. They were too deliberate to be animal tracks. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been watching me had followed me. I didn't stop. I ran, slipping and sliding in the mud, adrenaline pushing me forward. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I didn't look back. After what felt like hours, I reached the gravel road. Relief washed over me as I saw a car approaching in the distance. I flagged it down and the driver stopped immediately. I explained briefly, My words rushed and shaky. They offered to drive me to the nearest town. Once in town, I contacted the authorities. They took a report, and later, officers returned to the cabin to investigate. They found evidence that someone had been living in the forest near the cabin for some time. Makeshift campsites, discarded food, and crude traps. The footprints and marks on the cabin confirmed that I hadn't imagined anything. The area was being used by someone experienced at hiding and moving silently. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly isolation can become dangerous, how fragile safety can feel when someone is watching and waiting. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the forest not just for its beauty but for its unpredictability. Over the following weeks, I recovered physically and mentally. I made sure to travel in groups when going into remote areas to check maps and GPS signals, and to inform friends of my plans. I became meticulous about safety, realizing that being alone in the wilderness is not just an adventure. It carries risks that can escalate faster than most people expect. The fear that had gripped me in that cabin faded slowly, replaced by a cautious respect and awareness. Eventually, I was able to look back on the experience without panic. The fear had been real, but it had passed. I had survived, and I had learned something invaluable. Preparation, awareness, and caution are the only defenses when isolation meets human unpredictability. The cabin, the forest, and the nights of terror became lessons, etched into memory, shaping the way I approached solitude, wilderness, and safety forever. I had been planning this trip for months, and finally, the weekend had arrived. I wanted a break from everything: work, people, noise. The city had started to feel suffocating, and I was desperate to escape somewhere quiet, somewhere remote. I rented a small cabin deep in the mountains. The photos online made it look perfect. A single wooden structure with a porch, surrounded by dense pine forest, no neighbors for miles, a small river winding nearby. I packed carefully, bringing enough food, water, and supplies for the weekend, making sure I had extra batteries, candles, a first aid kit, and firewood. I even brought a small camping stove just in case. I wanted to be completely self-sufficient. The drive up the mountain was longer than I expected. The GPS barely worked past the town at the base, and the road narrowed to a rocky path, winding sharply along cliffs. The sun was already low when I finally arrived, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin looked exactly as in the pictures, a small, weathered wooden structure tucked into a clearing. The air was colder than I expected, crisp and slightly damp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I parked my car in the small clearing, took a deep breath, and felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. I spent the first hour unpacking, bringing everything inside, stacking the firewood neatly near the stove, checking that the water supply was sufficient, and lighting a small fire in the fireplace. The cabin was cozy but old, with creaky floorboards and narrow windows. It had a small kitchen area, a sleeping loft, and a single bathroom. I explored every corner, running my hands along the wooden walls, noting small cracks and the rough texture of the furniture. The isolation was overwhelming, but also strangely comforting. I told myself I was here to relax, to be alone, and that there was nothing to fear. The first night passed quietly. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, read for a few hours, and then went to bed, listening to the faint rustle of the trees outside. The cabin creaked as it cooled, the floorboards shifting under their own weight. I told myself it was normal that old cabins made these noises. Still, the sound of a sudden snap from the woods outside made my stomach tighten, though I tried to convince myself it was a branch breaking under its own weight. The next day, I decided to explore the surroundings. The cabin was near a small river that cut through the forest, and I wanted to walk along it, maybe find a good spot to sit and relax. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, my camera, and a flashlight, even though the sun was shining brightly. The forest was thick, the ground uneven, and I had to step carefully over roots and rocks. Birds called out from the treetops, and now and then, I would catch a glimpse of a squirrel darting between the trees. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, fresh and invigorating. I followed the river for several hours, climbing over rocks, slipping occasionally, and using my hands for balance. I felt a sense of accomplishment when I found a small clearing with smooth rocks by the water's edge. I sat there for a while, letting the sun warm my face, listening to the water babble over the stones. Time passed slowly. I didn't see another person, didn't hear any vehicles, and realized just how completely alone I was. It was peaceful, but a part of me couldn't shake a lingering unease. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had dipped low, and shadows stretched across the clearing. I started a fire in the fireplace again, feeling the heat radiate through the small cabin. I cooked a simple dinner, then sat near the window, drinking water and listening to the forest. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and the sound was louder than I expected, almost like whispers. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind. Still, I double-checked the locks on the cabin door. That night, I slept fitfully. Every sound seemed amplified. The floor creaking, branches scratching against the walls, the wind howling through the trees. I woke several times, heart pounding, convinced I had heard footsteps outside. I told myself it was paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The following morning, I decided to stay in the cabin, taking inventory of my supplies and trying to relax. As I moved through the small kitchen, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had stacked neatly near the stove was slightly disheveled, as if someone had moved a few logs. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I had checked everything the night before. Could the wind have blown it? I dismissed the thought. The cabin was solid, the windows shut. Something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't just the wind. I tried to go about my day normally, chopping more firewood, checking the water supply, organizing my belongings. But the sense of unease lingered. I started noticing other small things. Scratches on the floorboards that weren't there before, a footprint in the dust near the door that didn't match mine, and the subtle feeling of being watched. Each time I looked out the window, the trees seemed to shift unnaturally, and shadows moved where they shouldn't. My mind raced with possibilities, and I fought the rising panic, telling myself I was imagining things. By the evening, the wind had grown stronger. The trees swayed violently, and rain started to fall in heavy sheets. I sat by the fireplace, the warm glow barely keeping the darkness at bay. I noticed that the front door seemed slightly ajar, though I was sure I had locked it. My heart pounded. I approached cautiously, checking the locks again. Everything seemed secure, but the feeling of someone being outside, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was undeniable. I spent the night in a state of tense vigilance. Every sound made me jump. Branches snapping under the weight of the rain, the wind howling through the trees, and occasional, faint thuds against the walls. I clutched a heavy flashlight like a weapon, listening, trying to rationalize everything. I convinced myself it was just animals, the wind and wildlife playing tricks on me, but a part of me couldn't shake the fear that someone had been following me, watching me since I arrived. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping wet and the air heavy with moisture. I stepped outside to survey the clearing. My car was untouched, but the surrounding forest seemed different, more oppressive. As I approached the cabin door, I noticed deep footprints in the mud, leading from the tree line directly to the porch. They were human-sized. My pulse accelerated. I realized that I had not seen anyone all weekend, and yet these prints were unmistakable. They led straight to the cabin, then disappeared. I spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I moved heavy furniture in front of the door, checked all windows, and stacked firewood against the walls. I kept my backpack near me, filled with supplies, and kept the flashlight and a small hatchet within reach. I felt trapped, acutely aware of my vulnerability. Every crack of a branch outside made me flinch. Night came again, and this time I didn't sleep. I sat in the loft, watching the windows, listening to the forest. The wind was calm, but the air felt charged, as if waiting. Around midnight, I heard the softest whisper of movement outside, footsteps on the porch, the floor creaking under weight I could not see. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to do something. I gripped the hatchet, moving closer to the window. The steps stopped, and for a long time, there was only silence. Then, a shadow moved across the edge of the clearing, disappearing behind the trees. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. At first light, I packed everything into the car, leaving food, supplies, and even my carefully stacked firewood behind. My hands shook as I drove down the rocky path, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The forest that had seemed so beautiful just days ago now felt hostile, alive with unseen eyes. When I finally reached the main road, with the first signs of civilization appearing, I realized how close I had come to being trapped. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I found out that people had been breaking into isolated cabins in that area, sometimes staying hidden for days, watching the property, and leaving no trace. I had been lucky. The footprints, the disheveled firewood, the sounds outside. They were all signs that someone had been there, waiting, and I had left just in time. The experience changed me. I realized that isolation can be dangerous in ways no one considers. It's not the wind or the creaking floorboards that are frightening. It's the knowledge that someone else could be out there, invisible, patient, and ready. I never returned to that part of the mountains. When I hear about remote cabin rentals now, I think about what I saw, what I felt, and the fear that never left me that weekend. The mountains remain beautiful, but they are no longer safe in the way I imagined. I still think about the cabin. I wonder who had been there, how long they had been watching, and what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I try not to dwell on it, but I know I will never forget the feeling of being completely alone, and yet not alone at all. Even now, when I go hiking or camping in remote areas, I check and double-check my surroundings, lock my doors, and never let my guard down. The forest can be peaceful, it can be breathtaking, but it can also hide something or someone, waiting for the perfect moment. And I learned the hard way that being aware, cautious, and prepared is the only way to survive when you are truly alone. I had been looking forward to the weekend for months. My life in the city was a constant blur of noise, deadlines, and faces I barely recognized, and the thought of escaping it all for a couple of days in the woods filled me with a rare kind of peace. I chose a cabin deep in the forest, far from any road or cell phone signal, advertised as completely private, surrounded by nature, ideal for solitude. The reviews were sparse but glowing, emphasizing how quiet and isolated it was. That was exactly what I needed. I drove out early Friday morning, leaving the city behind as the streets turned into country roads, and country roads narrowed into winding paths lined with dense pine trees. My car rattled over small stones and dips in the unpaved road. Occasionally, a hawk would glide overhead, or a deer would dart across in front of me, its white tail flashing in the sunlight. I felt exhilaration in the isolation, a sense of finally leaving the city's weight behind. The GPS signal faded, then disappeared completely. At first, that made me a little nervous, but it also made me feel like I was stepping into a different world, one untouched and raw. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked smaller than in the pictures but quaint, made of rough-hewn logs, with a wide porch facing a clearing and a small creek trickling just beyond. Smoke from the chimney curled lazily into the sky. I parked, got out, and breathed in the smell of wet pine and moss. The air was sharp and clean, and it immediately washed away the stress I had been carrying. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let myself take in the space. It was sparsely furnished: a wooden table, a few chairs, a small wood stove, and a bed with a thick quilt, but cozy. There was a stack of firewood by the door and a few lanterns scattered around. No electricity, no internet, no distractions. Perfect. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting my bag down, and exploring the small space. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The windows were thick and slightly warped, making the outside view ripple slightly like water. Outside, the forest seemed quiet, but not silent. I could hear birds occasionally, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the constant, gentle gurgle of the creek. I decided to make a fire and started collecting kindling from the woodpile outside. It was harder than I expected. The wood was damp, and some logs were heavy. I stacked the kindling carefully, struck a match, and watched as the dry twigs caught flame, the fire crackling to life. The smell of smoke filled the cabin, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. As night began to fall, the forest darkened quickly. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the last light turned the sky pink, then deep purple and finally black. I had never experienced darkness like that. Even with the fire, the corners of the cabin seemed to melt into shadow. I could hear more of the forest now. The distant hoot of an owl, the scurrying of something small in the underbrush, and the occasional snap of a branch. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, not from cold, but from the overwhelming awareness that I was utterly alone. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would come quickly in this serene setting. But I was not prepared for the silence. It was so intense that every small sound seemed magnified. The wind whistled through cracks in the logs. A branch scraped against the roof. Somewhere outside, something large moved, heavy and deliberate, breaking the quiet with sudden urgency. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, something natural, but the timing and weight of the steps didn't seem right. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds, and eventually drifted into uneasy sleep. But the night did not end. I awoke suddenly, drenched in sweat, convinced I had heard something at the door. My eyes adjusted to the dim firelight, and I froze. There was a shadow just outside one of the windows, shifting ever so slightly. I could not tell if it was an animal or a person. The isolation suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I grabbed the small hatchet I had packed for emergencies and moved quietly toward the window, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the shadows move, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I began to realize just how vulnerable I was. There was no phone service, no way to call for help, no neighbors within miles. The idea of someone or something being outside while I was trapped inside alone terrified me. I kept the fire burning, stacking logs to make sure it didn't die, the light casting long shadows across the walls. Morning brought no relief. I barely slept, and every creak of the cabin roof or rustle outside made me jump. I decided to explore the surrounding area to get a better sense of my surroundings. I packed some food and water and slipped outside. The forest was dense, the trees close together, the ground uneven with roots and rocks. I stayed in the clearing near the cabin, careful not to venture too far. The creek sparkled in the morning light, and for a moment, the scene seemed peaceful. I thought perhaps my fears were just the product of isolation and the unfamiliar. But the lingering dread would not leave me. Over the next day, I tried to occupy myself. I gathered firewood, explored the edges of the clearing, and even tried to read a book. Every sound outside, however small, made me flinch. I noticed subtle signs that I was not alone. Footprints in the mud near the creek that were too large and irregular to be a deer, and broken branches that suggested something or someone had been moving around the cabin while I slept. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but every explanation seemed inadequate. I began setting up a perimeter around the cabin with rocks and sticks in a crude attempt to alert myself if anyone approached. That night, the sounds returned with a vengeance. This time, I could hear them moving closer. Heavy steps, deliberate and slow, circling the cabin. I could hear a low scrape on the wooden walls as if someone was testing the door. My pulse shot up and I realized that I needed a plan. I packed essentials into my bag, water, food, matches, and the hatchet, and positioned myself near the window with the fire behind me. The shadows moved closer. Then I noticed the glint of metal in the moonlight, an axe leaning against a tree, clearly placed to intimidate me. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think. I could not fight someone outside the cabin, and I had no way to call for help. The only way out was to survive the night and hope they left. I spent hours quietly observing the shadows, tracking movements through the faint light. I remembered every exit, every piece of furniture I could use for defense. I kept the fire blazing, its warmth and light giving me a small sense of control. As dawn approached, the sounds finally subsided. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside. The forest seemed calmer, but the footprints and broken branches confirmed my fear. They had been here, circling, watching. I gathered more firewood, reinforced the cabin's doors and windows with heavy logs, and carefully planned my next steps. I realized I could not stay alone here anymore. I packed what I could carry and prepared to hike back to the nearest road. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening, but still intimidating. Every shadow, every movement kept me on edge. The hike back was exhausting. I moved quickly but cautiously, sticking to the trail I had followed earlier. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the brush made me jump, but I forced myself to keep moving. Hours later, I finally saw a faint road in the distance. Relief washed over me as I emerged from the dense forest and spotted a car parked along the shoulder. I approached cautiously, waving my hands to get attention. A man inside stopped and looked at me, surprised. I explained I had been staying in a cabin nearby, alone, and that I feared for my safety. The man called the authorities for me, and soon a forest ranger arrived. We returned to the cabin. It looked peaceful in the daylight, almost innocent, but the signs were unmistakable. Footprints around the perimeter, a tree branch lodged against the door, and a discarded hatchet. The ranger confirmed that while there had been reports of trespassers in the area before, the cabin's isolation made it particularly vulnerable. He advised me never to stay there alone again. I left the cabin that day with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. The experience had been terrifying, a stark reminder of how isolated and vulnerable one can be in the wilderness. But I had survived. I had kept calm, thought ahead, and escaped a potentially deadly situation. The memory of the night would stay with me forever, a chilling lesson in caution, preparedness, and the unexpected dangers of isolation. From that day forward, I never underestimated the power of solitude in the wilderness. I learned to respect it, to prepare meticulously, and to trust my instincts. Every time I think back to that cabin, I remember the silence that pressed down on me like a weight, the shadows that shifted outside, and the fear that nearly consumed me. But I also remember my determination, the small fire I kept burning, and the way daylight finally brought safety. I survived, and the clarity of that survival, the attention to detail and planning, is what still comforts me when I think of those terrifying nights in the forest. I had been planning the trip for months, a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains, far from roads, far from people, far from the world. I had chosen the place because of the isolation. I wanted silence, and I wanted the kind of solitude that made you feel both alive and small, as though the forest itself could swallow you whole if it wanted. The drive there was long and rough, mostly dirt roads that twisted between tall pines and sudden drops into ravines. My car struggled with the incline at times, scraping its undercarriage against loose rocks, and I had to back up more than once to avoid cliffs that rose too sharply for my nerves. By the time I reached the final trailhead, the sun was dipping behind the trees, painting the sky orange and pink, and shadows stretched like fingers across the gravel. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, the kind of place that felt untouched for decades. It was a simple structure. Rough-hewn logs, a slanted roof, a stone chimney, and windows so dusty I couldn't see inside until I was nearly on top of them. The door was heavy, and the latch squeaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but beneath that, there was a kind of sweetness, a faint aroma of pine that must have seeped in over the years. Dust motes floated in the fading light, and the floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped carefully, taking in every detail. A table leaned slightly to one side, a few chairs were stacked awkwardly in a corner, and a metal stove sat in the middle of the main room, its flue coated in soot. There were shelves, mostly empty, except for a few rusted tins and some broken glass jars. I set down my pack and went straight to the windows. The forest surrounded the clearing completely. No paths, no roads, just dense trees stretching to the horizon. A thin layer of fog had started forming in the lower areas between the trees, and it moved like smoke curling up from the earth. I felt an odd thrill, a nervous excitement at the quiet, the way it pressed against me from all sides. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to settle in before dark. I lit a small fire in the stove, watching the flames crackle and spit embers as I arranged my sleeping bag on the floor near it. The warmth was comforting, but it didn't reach the shadows that pooled in the corners of the cabin. Night came quickly. I had planned to sleep early, but I found myself restless, listening to the sounds outside. Branches snapping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the wind moving through the pines. It wasn't frightening, exactly, but it was constant, and after a few hours my mind began to notice patterns. A branch that fell in the distance sounded like footsteps. A shadow crossing the window looked like a figure, only to vanish when I looked directly. I reminded myself over and over that I was alone, that the forest was empty of anything that could threaten me. And yet, there was a weight in the darkness, a tension that grew the longer I listened. I slept fitfully, waking at strange intervals. Once, I swore I heard someone, or something, outside, moving slowly around the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear over the creak of the old wood. The sound stopped, and after a long minute, I convinced myself it had been an animal. There were bears and wolves in these mountains. The thought calmed me, though not entirely. By morning, I was exhausted, my body tight from sleeping on the hard floor, but the sun brought some comfort, the way light pushes shadows into corners where they belong. I gathered firewood from the clearing and stacked it neatly near the stove. My movements were slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if the act of preparing for the day was armor against the unease of the night. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin, keeping to the small clearing and the immediate edges of the forest. The trees were older than any I had seen before, thick and tall, their roots twisting across the ground in a maze of wood and stone. I noticed old tracks in the mud, deer mostly, and smaller animals I couldn't identify. There were no signs of people, no trash, no evidence that anyone had walked these trails recently. It felt like I had stumbled into a place untouched by human hands. That feeling should have been comforting, but it made the forest feel alive in a way I couldn't name, watching me, waiting. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into a memory that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I had been planning it for weeks, looking forward to escaping the city, the noise, the endless responsibilities. The idea of a cabin alone in the woods, miles from anyone, felt like freedom. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place where I could just breathe and forget the outside world. I had found a small cabin online, one of those places that promised isolation, a rustic feel, and a beautiful view of the forest. The photos looked perfect: wooden walls, a small porch overlooking a lake, and a fireplace that seemed just big enough to make the room feel cozy. I packed my car with everything I thought I'd need: food for 3 days, a cooler, blankets, batteries, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't naive. I knew the woods could be dangerous, and I had been careful, but I didn't expect what came next. The drive was long, almost 4 hours, through winding roads that seemed narrower the further I went. Trees pressed in on either side, their branches brushing the car windows, and the occasional deer would dart across the road, disappearing into the shadows. The sun was low when I finally arrived, just starting to sink behind the hills. The cabin was exactly like the pictures, maybe even more isolated than I had imagined. It sat at the edge of a small clearing with dense forest on 3 sides. The porch creaked as I stepped out, and I felt that strange mix of excitement and unease you get when you are alone somewhere unfamiliar. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and a faint, lingering scent of smoke from the fireplace. Dust covered the shelves, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, but it wasn't dirty. It was just empty, untouched. I set down my bags, unpacked some food, and made a small fire in the fireplace. The first night was quiet in a way I had never experienced. There were no cars, no planes, no city sounds, just the occasional rustle of leaves and distant birds settling in for the night. I slept well at first, though I woke once to a strange scratching sound at the window. I assumed it was a raccoon or some other animal, nothing more. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that led down to the lake. The water was calm and clear, reflecting the trees like glass. I spent hours just walking along the shoreline, listening to the wind in the branches. Everything felt surreal, like I was the only person in the world. I saw tracks in the dirt, deer mostly, and maybe some smaller animals, but nothing threatening. I returned to the cabin as the sun started to set, making dinner and watching the flames in the fireplace dance. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I had finished dinner, cleaned up, and was sitting on the porch with a book when I heard it. A faint sound at first, almost like footsteps crunching on the dirt. I froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped when I stopped moving. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I went inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. The cabin had sturdy locks, and I felt safe, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the noise. Hours passed, and I eventually fell asleep, though I woke a few times to the sound of something scratching outside the cabin. The next morning, I went out early to check the area around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place at first, just the usual animal tracks. But then I noticed something strange near the edge of the woods, not far from the cabin. There were footprints, but they weren't deer or any kind of animal I recognized. They were human. Small, maybe a man, judging by the shoe size. My heart started pounding. I had expected isolation, but I hadn't expected someone else to be this close without my knowing. The prints led into the woods and didn't seem to return. I told myself it was probably a hiker or someone passing through, but a cold feeling settled in my stomach. That day, I tried to keep busy, chopping some firewood, cleaning the cabin, and exploring a bit further down the trail. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me stop and look around. I kept reminding myself I was alone and probably safe, but my anxiety was growing. By evening, I was almost hyper-aware of every sound. The wind picked up as I was making dinner, rattling the windows, and the firelight cast shadows that danced across the walls. That night, the noises were louder, closer. I heard breathing outside the cabin. It was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Then it stopped. I had been driving for hours, the road winding through the dense forest like a ribbon stretched too thin. The sun had just dipped behind the mountains when I finally spotted the small cabin tucked into a clearing. It was far off any main road, far enough that the radio signal had died miles ago, leaving only the hum of my engine and the occasional chirp of birds retreating into the night. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, its wooden exterior weathered, the roof showing streaks where rain had carved channels over decades. But something about it drew me in. I had rented it online for a solo weekend, craving isolation, a chance to get away from the constant noise and demands of the city. Parking my car on the uneven ground, I grabbed my backpack and stepped out. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet soil. I could hear the wind stirring the trees and the occasional snap of a branch breaking under the weight of something unseen. I tried not to think about it, focusing instead on the cabin itself. Its door was slightly warped, but the latch worked, and I pushed inside. The cabin smelled of dust and wood, with a faint, underlying mustiness that told me it hadn't been occupied for a while. I flicked on my flashlight, letting the beam cut through the dim interior. The main room was simple. A small kitchenette, a wooden table with chairs, a wood stove that had clearly not been used in months, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft. I set my backpack down and took a slow, deliberate walk around, inspecting everything, my fingers brushing over the surfaces, feeling the grooves in the worn wood. The first night was unnerving. Every little sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant animal, the shift of branches, made me tense. I tried to distract myself by unpacking and preparing a small meal. As I worked, I noticed how quiet the forest could be when there was no human presence around. The absence of life was almost palpable, like a pressure pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity making my imagination run wild. When I finally went to bed in the loft, I could hear the wind rattling the windows. The bed was narrow and creaked with every movement, the mattress thin. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I wasn't being watched, that nothing was out there, and yet my mind refused to settle. Every little sound made my heart race. A branch scraping against the cabin's side, the distant howl of an animal, the scurry of small creatures across the roof. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, waking often to the same noises, each time my body tensing with fear. The next morning, the forest looked different in daylight. The shadows that had been so menacing the night before were now just trees and underbrush. I took a walk around the clearing, noting the wildlife, birds flitting from branch to branch, squirrels darting along fallen logs. I even saw a deer in the distance, its movements graceful and unafraid. The sunlight filtering through the trees brought a strange sense of calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a weight at the edge of my senses. Something that wasn't there yet made me hyper-aware. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area. There was a small creek nearby, water moving over smooth stones, and a series of old logging trails that had long been reclaimed by nature. Walking those trails was eerie in a quiet way. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I noticed broken branches lying across the path in patterns that didn't seem random, as if someone, or something, had passed through recently. My pulse quickened as I realized how little time had passed since the cabin had been vacated. Whoever had been here before me might not have left long ago. That night, the unease returned. It was quieter this time, but there was a rhythm to the sounds outside. A deliberate pattern of movement that didn't belong to the wind or normal wildlife. I stayed up, flashlight in hand, eyes glued to the windows. The forest seemed alive with subtle shifts, shadows flitting just beyond the edge of my vision. I convinced myself to sleep eventually, telling myself that it was paranoia. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was testing me, watching from the dark. The following day, I decided to venture further. I had brought a map, but the trails were not clearly marked, overgrown in places and easy to lose. I walked for hours, documenting the small details. Moss growing thick on the north side of trees, bird calls echoing through the canopy, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I found signs of human activity, an old campsite with a rusted stove, a fire pit surrounded by stones, but nothing recent. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I couldn't explain it rationally, yet my instincts screamed caution. That evening, the wind picked up. It shook the trees violently, sending rain slanting against the windows. I had underestimated how cold it could get, and the fire barely kept the room warm. I moved my sleeping bag closer and wrapped myself in extra blankets, listening as water dripped from the eaves and pooled on the ground outside. Then came the sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, like dragging. It came from the woods just beyond the clearing, slow and deliberate. I froze. It wasn't animal. I knew the difference, the way it moved, heavy and steady. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the tree line, but the beam only caught empty shadows. I kept watching, heart hammering, the sound continuing intermittently, closer now, then fading, as if it was circling the cabin. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake the entire night, fire burning low, flashlight clutched in my hand, eyes darting to every movement outside. I kept thinking about the logs of the cabin, the weak points in the walls, the windows, the door latch. Every scenario I could imagine ran through my mind. A bear clawing at the door, a human intruder hiding in the trees. I realized I had brought no weapon beyond my camping knife, and that thought sent another wave of panic through me. By dawn, I was shaking, exhausted, but alive. The forest had been quiet since the first rays of sunlight pushed away the night. I felt no relief, only the weight of what had been waiting out there, invisible but present. I spent the next day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I checked all the locks, pushed heavy furniture against the doors and windows, and created simple noise traps around the perimeter with tin cans and sticks. It was primitive, but it gave me a sense of control. I kept my knife close, my fire burning constantly, and I slept in short bursts, always waking to check for movement. Nights blended into days in a blur of tension, fear, and exhaustion. I realized how vulnerable I was, how alone, and how the forest could have taken me at any moment without anyone ever knowing. By the third day, I was running low on supplies. I had brought food for a week, but the constant vigilance had drained me more than the physical exertion of chopping wood and hauling water. I knew I had to leave, but the thought of walking through the forest with no protection filled me with dread. I waited until the early morning, planning to move fast and stay alert. The ground was damp with frost, and the wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily silent. I packed quickly, stuffing my bag, grabbing my flashlight, my knife, and the few tools I had. Every sound seemed amplified. A bird calling, a branch snapping, the crunch of my own footsteps. My heart raced the entire way as I moved toward the nearest dirt road, the one I had driven in on. I kept my senses sharp, eyes scanning every shadow, ears straining for the slightest movement. It took hours. Hours of tense, careful walking, each step deliberate. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my body aching, my mind on high alert. Once, I thought I saw movement behind me, in the mist between the trees, but when I turned, there was nothing. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept moving. Finally, just as the sun was dipping again, I reached the edge of the forest where the dirt road began. My legs gave way in relief, and I sat on the cold ground for a moment, breathing heavily, listening to the world outside the forest. The wind through open fields, the distant hum of cars, the soft sounds of civilization. I had survived. I had made it out. Driving down the road, I kept glancing at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It was just a dark silhouette against the trees, quiet, still, waiting. I didn't know what had been making the dragging sounds, if it had been a human, an animal, or something I could never identify. I didn't care. I felt a mix of triumph and lingering fear, knowing how fragile life can be when you are isolated, and how easily a moment of solitude can turn into a test of survival. When I finally reached the first real town, the lights of houses and the sounds of people filled me with a sense of safety I hadn't realized I had missed. I stopped at a small diner, ordered a hot coffee, and let the warmth and chatter wash over me. The forest was behind me, the cabin a memory, and the world felt solid again. Even weeks later, I still remembered the fear. I remembered the silence, the dark, the way my own mind had tried to trick me in the dead of night. But I also remembered the lessons. Preparation matters, vigilance can save you, and sometimes survival isn't about bravery, but about patience, awareness, and persistence. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the gear I had used, convinced I would never take solitude so seriously again. And yet, part of me knew I would always carry that experience, that deep knowledge of fear and isolation, like a shadow under my skin, reminding me that the world is bigger and stranger than it seems, and that surviving it is a quiet, personal triumph. I spent the next day cautiously exploring the area, trying to understand what I was dealing with. The footprints were gone, but I noticed small signs, broken branches, disturbed underbrush, things that suggested someone had been moving through the area recently. My phone had no signal, of course, and I couldn't call anyone if I needed help. By late afternoon, I realized I had to take precautions. I moved the heavier furniture against the doors and windows, made sure I had a knife and a large flashlight close by, and kept the fire going in case I needed light quickly. I slept fitfully that night, every sound making me tense. I didn't leave the cabin after dark anymore. On the third day, I decided to go into the woods, cautiously following the trail, to see if I could spot any signs of who, or what, might have been near the cabin. The forest was thick, and I moved slowly, watching for tracks or anything unusual. About half a mile from the cabin, I saw a small campfire site that looked recent. The ashes were still warm, and there were remnants of food wrappers and a discarded water bottle. My heart sank. Someone had been here, close enough to see me in the cabin if they wanted. I didn't stay to investigate further. I marked the area in my mind and hurried back to the cabin. That evening, I took more precautions. I moved all my food and supplies to a locked closet, reinforced the windows with chairs, and made sure I had my backpack ready to leave at a moment's notice. I felt trapped, but I refused to let fear control me. I spent the night listening carefully, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness outside. I didn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone in the woods. The fourth day was the worst. I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside, walking in the dirt near the cabin. They circled the building slowly, almost deliberately. I grabbed my knife, holding it tightly, and waited. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft thump on the roof. My mind raced. Someone was out there trying to intimidate me or worse. I stayed in the corner of the room, breathing slowly, waiting for daylight. Hours passed. By late morning, the footsteps had stopped, and there was silence. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed everything quickly, keeping my backpack and knife within reach. I decided to leave immediately, taking the trail back to the main road. I moved cautiously, constantly checking behind me for any signs of movement. The forest felt different now, darker, heavier, as if it was pressing in on me. Every shadow seemed to move, every noise was amplified. About halfway to the road, I saw a figure standing between the trees, watching me. I froze. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move. I didn't stop either. I kept walking, slow but steady, keeping my eyes on him. The man didn't follow, at least not at first. When I reached the road, I ran. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I didn't look back. A car passed by eventually, and I flagged it down, giving the driver the story as best I could while gasping for air. The driver called the police, and within an hour, a patrol car arrived. They searched the area around the cabin, but there was no one there. The footprints, the signs of the campfire, and the figure in the woods were all gone. They told me it could have been a transient, someone hiding in the woods, but they didn't promise they would find him. In the end, I never went back to that cabin. I realized that isolation, which I had craved, could also be dangerous in ways I hadn't imagined. The forest was beautiful, peaceful, and calm by day, but at night, it could hide anyone, and there was no one to help if something went wrong. The experience stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the breathing outside, the figure in the trees. I told myself I was lucky to get out safely, and that I would never underestimate the unpredictability of being alone in the wilderness again. Even months later, I couldn't forget that sense of being watched, of hearing someone moving outside while I was trapped inside. It changed the way I looked at quiet, isolated places. Peace could hide danger, and being alone was never truly being alone. I learned to respect that, and to be prepared, but the memory of those nights in the cabin never left me. Every time I hear footsteps in the dark, or leaves rustling outside, I think back to that cabin and remember just how close I came to something I wasn't ready for. As the day drew to a close, I began heading back toward the cabin, taking a less familiar route. That was when I first heard it, a distant, uneven crunching sound coming from the underbrush. I froze. The sound stopped when I did. I waited, straining my ears, heart pounding in my chest. Then it started again, closer this time, moving with intent. I quickened my pace, brushing past branches, my mind imagining all sorts of threats. A bear, a wolf, or worse, another human. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, suffocating. I finally reached the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I bolted the door, checked all the windows, and set traps with what I could find. Sticks, heavy stones, anything to give me a warning if someone tried to enter. That night, I slept with one eye open, my backpack packed and ready by the door. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked alive. I felt cornered, as though the forest itself had turned against me, conspiring to make me anxious, to break my calm. Days passed, each one stretching longer than the last. I rationed my food, walked cautiously, and kept a close eye on the surroundings. Each night the noises grew bolder. Scraping along the walls, soft steps on the porch, the occasional thud inside the cabin itself. I could never see anyone, never catch a glimpse of an intruder. I considered leaving, but the forest outside seemed endless, and the road back was confusing and poorly marked. It was safer, I told myself, to stay inside and wait for daylight when I could navigate better. On the fifth night, the sounds became deliberate. I could hear slow, careful footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, I saw a shadow move past the window, a shape too tall and too deliberate to be an animal. My mind raced with scenarios. Someone had found me. Someone had been watching since I arrived. Panic settled in, heavy and unrelenting. I barricaded the door with everything I could find, moved the furniture against it, and sat behind it, clutching a kitchen knife and a flashlight. I refused to move, refusing to give any hint that I knew they were there. Morning finally came, and the forest looked indifferent, as if nothing had happened. I peered outside cautiously. Nothing moved. No footprints, no disturbance. I knew I couldn't stay another night, not with someone or something so intent on scaring me. I packed quickly, keeping my movements deliberate, aware that any sudden noise could draw attention. I didn't look back as I walked to the road, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. When I reached the main road, I ran into a small group of hikers. I approached them and explained my situation, and one of them kindly offered to drive me to the nearest town. I was shaking, exhausted, and barely able to speak in coherent sentences. We drove away, leaving the forest and the cabin behind. The sense of relief was overwhelming, the tension slowly melting away as the hum of the car and the presence of other humans reminded me I was no longer alone. Once in town, I reported my experience to the local authorities. They assured me that cabins like the one I stayed in were often used by trespassers or people seeking isolated spots for questionable reasons. While they found no evidence of anyone having been inside during my stay, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, someone watching, waiting. The memory haunted me for months, the sense of eyes in the dark and footsteps around the cabin lingering in my mind. Eventually, I returned to normal life, but I was changed. I couldn't go into the woods alone without planning, without precautions. The experience taught me the fragility of isolation, how quickly peace can turn into fear, and how small human instincts can save you if you trust them. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. But the story of those nights, the sensation of being hunted while completely alone, remains vivid in my memory. It's a reminder of the wilderness's quiet power and the unpredictability of what or who you might encounter when you step off the beaten path. I had been planning the trip for weeks. My life had been a blur of work, traffic, and city noise, and I felt an overwhelming need to escape. The idea of a secluded cabin in the forest, surrounded by nothing but trees, the wind, and the quiet, seemed perfect. I found a small cabin listed online, far from any major roads, deep in the woods of northern Maine. The pictures were modest but inviting. A wooden structure with a steep roof, a stone fireplace, and large windows that let in the surrounding forest. Promised isolation, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed a week's worth of food, a sleeping bag, warm clothes, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, a small stove, and extra water. I told myself I was prepared, though I had no idea how deeply unprepared I really was for what awaited me. The drive was long and quiet, with the scenery slowly shifting from suburban sprawl to dense forest. The further I drove, the thinner the traffic became until it vanished entirely. The GPS signal weakened as I left the main road, forcing me to navigate using the faintly marked forest routes on the screen. The air smelled cleaner, and the only sound was the occasional bird or rustle in the underbrush. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the rough driveway. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown, maybe even more rustic and lonely. A thin layer of moss covered the roof, and the wooden siding had faded in some spots, but it all added to the sense of being removed from the world. I unloaded my car quickly, eager to get inside before darkness fully set in. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled faintly of dust and old wood. A small kitchen sat to one side, and the fireplace dominated the main room. The furniture was sparse. A worn couch, a table, a few chairs, and a bed tucked into the corner. I checked the stove and the small woodpile near the fireplace, feeling a little comforted that I could make a fire if I needed warmth. The isolation was immediate, and I felt a mix of excitement and unease. I set up my sleeping area, organized my supplies, and then went outside one last time before nightfall to take in the surrounding forest. The trees pressed in close around the cabin, the ground uneven and covered in pine needles. Everything felt silent except for the occasional crack of a branch under some unseen animal's foot. Night came quickly. I lit the fireplace and cooked a small meal on the stove. The fire crackled and threw dancing shadows across the walls, making the cabin feel alive in a way I wasn't used to. As I ate, I felt a sense of solitude that was both soothing and unsettling. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to groan and the branches to scrape against the cabin walls. Every so often, I thought I heard a thump, like something large moving in the underbrush. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. I was alone here, completely alone. The thought should have been liberating, but instead it gnawed at me. After dinner, I cleaned up and settled near the fireplace with a book. The firelight flickered across the walls, casting strange shadows that made the cabin seem larger than it was. I could hear the wind outside, and every so often, a loud snap of a branch would make me jump. Around midnight, I went to check the perimeter of the cabin, wanting to reassure myself that nothing was lurking near the windows or doors. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees, underbrush, and the uneven ground. Every rustle sounded magnified in the quiet night. I moved slowly, my senses heightened, until I was satisfied that the immediate area around the cabin was empty. I returned inside and tried to sleep, but the sounds outside kept me restless. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a soft thumping sound on the porch. My heart jumped into my throat. The cabin's door was locked. I knew that, but the sound persisted. A dull, deliberate thud, followed by silence, then another thud. I froze, straining to listen. The thudding stopped, and I waited, hoping it was just the wind or a falling branch. Then came the scratching. Not random, but precise, like claws or nails being dragged across the wood. I gripped the flashlight, hands trembling, and shone it at the door. The beam illuminated nothing. I told myself it was a raccoon or a small animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be a small animal. My heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through me. I remembered the small axe I had brought for firewood. I grabbed it and approached the door cautiously, listening for any movement. The scratching stopped as I neared. I pressed my eye to the window next to the door, sweeping the flashlight around the porch. There was nothing. The forest was still. My pulse slowed slightly, but the unease lingered. I returned to the fireplace, axe in hand, and stayed awake until the first light of dawn. Every sound, the wind, the shifting trees, distant bird calls, felt amplified, threatening. Morning brought some relief. The forest looked peaceful, almost serene. I convinced myself I had imagined the sounds or that a deer had brushed against the porch. I gathered firewood and chopped some branches, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. I explored a small path near the cabin, but the deeper I walked into the forest, the more isolated I felt. By midday, I had convinced myself that the night had been a fluke. On the 5th day, I caught my first glimpse of the person. I had stepped outside early to fetch more firewood. I was careful, scanning the tree line before moving. As I bent to pick up a log, I saw movement. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden among the trees. I froze. They didn't move or approach. They simply watched. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me. I raised the rod slowly, ready to defend myself if necessary. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they retreated into the forest. From that moment, fear became a constant companion. I stayed inside the cabin almost entirely, only venturing out when necessary. I kept the fire going day and night, and I slept with the rod by my side, ready for any intruder. Every noise outside made me jump. A branch breaking underfoot, the flap of an animal in the underbrush. Even the wind rustling through the leaves sounded like footsteps. I knew I couldn't call for help. The phone was useless, and the nearest road was miles away. I had to rely on my own wits, my own preparation. By the 6th day, I realized the intruder had been learning my patterns. I found footprints leading to the back of the cabin, around to the side where I kept my supplies. Someone had been rummaging quietly while I slept or was away. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I had to be methodical. I began setting traps around the cabin, simple snares and alarms made from cans and strings. I reinforced the doors and windows, making it more difficult for anyone to enter. I also began creating escape routes, mapping paths through the forest I could use to flee if necessary. The 7th day was the worst. I woke before dawn to a noise at the door. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, moving slowly as if testing my defenses. My heart pounded. I gripped the rod and waited, watching through the small window. The figure was there, indistinct, silhouetted against the dim light. They tried the door handle, tested the barricades. I could see them adjusting something in their hands, a tool perhaps. Fear and adrenaline surged through me. I realized I couldn't stay passive. I couldn't wait for them to break in. I made a decision. I waited until they moved away from the door and then quietly opened a back exit I had prepared. I slipped into the forest, moving carefully and silently along the path I had memorized. I kept to the shadows, using the trees for cover, my heart hammering with every step. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put distance between myself and that cabin, between myself and the person who had been stalking me. Hours passed as I moved through the forest. The sun rose, but I didn't stop. Hunger and exhaustion clawed at me, but I kept going, following a faint trail that eventually led me to a dirt road. I walked along it until I saw a passing car. I ran into the road, waving frantically. The driver stopped, and I collapsed into the vehicle, gasping for breath. I explained as best I could, and they called the police. The authorities came the next day. They inspected the cabin and the surrounding area. Footprints and signs of intrusion were evident. Someone had been living in the forest near the cabin, watching and following me. They had been cautious and skilled enough to avoid direct confrontation, but their intent was clear. They had been observing me for days. The cabin was abandoned now, my belongings untouched, but the sense of danger lingering in every corner. In the end, I never learned who it was. They were never caught, but I learned something about myself, about fear, about survival. I had faced a real human threat, something far more terrifying than any storybook ghost or fairy tale. I had survived because I stayed alert, because I prepared, because I trusted my instincts. The cabin, once a place of solitude and peace, had become a test of endurance, a trial that pushed me to the edge. Months later, I returned to the cabin, not to stay, but to collect what I had left. I approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings. The forest seemed calm, almost peaceful. The cabin stood silent, empty, its wooden walls weathered by wind and rain. I collected my belongings quickly, my eyes never resting in one place for too long. As I left, I realized that the fear I had felt there would stay with me, a constant reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly isolation can turn into vulnerability. But I also felt a quiet pride. I had survived, fully aware, fully present, and I had returned to the world with a deeper understanding of both fear and resilience. The forest behind me faded into the distance as I drove back along the dirt road. The trees thickened and then thinned, and the signs of civilization began to appear again. The cabin was gone from my immediate sight, but the memory remained vivid. The quiet, the shadows, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. I knew I would never return to that place to stay, but I also knew I had faced something real, raw, and terrifying, and I had endured it. I had been alone in the forest, vulnerable and watched, and I had survived with my senses, my wit, and my will intact. That experience stayed with me, lingering in quiet moments, in the rustle of leaves, in the creak of old doors. I thought about it often, reflecting on how easily ordinary places can become dangerous, how easily solitude can become exposure. And yet, despite the fear, Despite the threat, there was a clarity that came from surviving it. The cabin, the forest, the intruder. They had tested me, pushed me to my limits, and left me stronger, sharper, and aware of the world's quiet, hidden dangers. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. Work had been a grinding machine, eating away at every shred of energy and patience I had left. The city felt oppressive. The streets were filled with noise, people constantly pushing past one another, cars honking, and the endless hum of air conditioning units and sirens. I needed silence. I needed air that smelled like trees and earth, not exhaust fumes and cheap coffee. That's how I ended up driving my beat-up hatchback along winding mountain roads, with a cabin rental tucked deep into the woods of a remote valley. The GPS promised seclusion, a dirt road leading miles away from the last signs of civilization, and a cabin that looked small but sturdy on the pictures. A simple wooden structure with a porch overlooking a creek. The sun was starting its slow descent when I finally turned off the main road. The dirt track was narrow, uneven, with tree roots and stones jutting up in ways that made my tires groan. I could see tire tracks from previous visitors, but they were faded and washed out in parts. I drove slowly, focusing on the darkening horizon and the dense forest pressing in on either side. Shadows were already creeping over the landscape, long and shapeless. The air smelled rich and earthy, a mixture of pine and wet soil. I parked near a small clearing, the cabin just ahead. Its wooden exterior was weathered, gray with age, but solid. The windows were clean, reflecting the last light of the sun, and a stone chimney rose on one side, though there was no smoke yet. I got out of the car and felt the sudden chill of late afternoon air. There was a dampness to it, subtle, like the kind that creeps into your bones when you stand still for too long. The forest around the cabin was thick, with pine and oak trees forming walls of green that blocked most of the fading light. I carried my backpack and supplies to the porch, trying to shake off a strange, tight feeling in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease, the kind that comes from being completely alone in a place you've only seen in pictures. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old furniture, faintly of dust and mildew. It was small but functional, a living area with a couch, a small dining table, and a fireplace. A compact kitchen with a stove and a fridge, and a bedroom at the back with a simple bed and a dresser. I unpacked my things methodically, placing food in the fridge, setting up my small gas stove, and arranging my sleeping area. I lit a single lamp, the soft yellow glow cutting through the shadows of the cabin. Outside, the light from the sun was gone, leaving only a dim, fading blue that barely lit the clearing. The forest outside looked like a solid wall of darkness. By the time I finished, it was nearly dusk. I stepped onto the porch, looking out at the creek that cut through the clearing. Water flowed over rocks in a soothing, steady murmur. I felt a strange sense of relief at that sound, like something alive was still moving in the world. I built a small fire in the stone fire pit just off the porch. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and I sat in a folding chair, letting the warmth seep through my jacket. The first night felt calm, almost perfect. No sounds of civilization, only the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft gurgle of water. I went to bed early, feeling heavy and content, and drifted off to sleep. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. My body was tense, alert, though I wasn't sure why. The cabin was quiet. I listened closely, just the creek, just the wind moving through the trees. But then I noticed it. A faint sound outside, rhythmic and deliberate, not random like the wind. It was a scraping, dragging noise. My stomach dropped and I froze. I had no weapon, only a flashlight and a small camping knife in my bag. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an animal, deer, raccoon, something that had found its way through the undergrowth. But the sound repeated, now closer, circling the cabin. My heart pounded, and I realized that it wasn't moving randomly. It was deliberate, cautious, precise. Someone or something was outside, moving along the edge of the clearing. I stayed completely still, straining to hear, trying not to breathe too loudly. The sound stopped. My mind raced. I considered locking the doors, but the cabin had no deadbolt, only a simple latch. Panic rose, hot and tight in my chest. I wanted to call someone, but there was no cell service. I remembered the emergency number on the cabin information sheet, but it was only for emergencies that required calling from a landline. I didn't have one. I was trapped with no one around for miles. The second night was worse. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, shaking the cabin and causing the roof to creak. The thumping started again, this time louder and more insistent. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fireplace, axe within reach, listening. Around midnight, I heard something moving in the underbrush, large footsteps crunching leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. A large shape darted behind a tree. I froze, heart racing. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal I recognized. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically. I realized I had made a mistake by staying so long in one place without a plan. I tried to think logically. I had a car, I had fuel, I had food. I could leave, but the roads were not well marked, and in the dark, I might get lost. I decided to wait until dawn. The night dragged on, each minute stretching endlessly. The thumping, the scratching, the large footsteps. They persisted, sometimes pausing, sometimes circling, keeping me in a constant state of fear. By 5 a.m., the first light barely lit the forest. Exhausted and tense, I decided I could not wait any longer. I packed everything into the car as quietly as possible, careful not to make any noise that would attract attention. As I drove away, the feeling of being watched never left me. The isolation, the forest, the night, it had all played a part in making me hyper-aware, paranoid even. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure following the car. But there was nothing. The road was empty. By late morning, I reached a small town and stopped at a gas station, still trembling, still trying to make sense of what I had experienced. I told myself that staying in the cabin had been a mistake, that the isolation had amplified every sound, every shadow, every natural noise. In the days after, I researched the area. I learned that there were reports of a person living in the woods nearby, someone who had been known to stalk the forest, sometimes approaching cabins at night. I realized, with a chill, that what I had heard and felt might have been a human being, not an animal or the wind. The idea of someone watching me, circling my cabin, waiting in the darkness, was far worse than anything supernatural. I was lucky to have left when I did. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for months, shaping my understanding of isolation and vulnerability. I began to appreciate the importance of preparation, of understanding the environment you choose to inhabit, and of respecting the unseen dangers that can lurk even in a seemingly peaceful forest. The fear I felt was raw and human, born not of myths or tales, but of reality, the presence of another human, unknown and potentially dangerous, in a place where there should have been only solitude. Eventually, I found a way to process the fear. I hiked in other forests, but never alone, never without communication or a plan. I realized that what had scared me most was not the forest, not the cabin, not the darkness. It was the unknown intentions of another human being. The fear was rational, grounded in reality, and surviving it taught me more about caution, awareness, and resilience than any story could. Looking back, I can see that the cabin itself was never the danger. It was the choice to isolate myself without understanding the potential threats around me. I carry that lesson with me, a reminder of how real and tangible fear can be when rooted in human behavior rather than fantasy. The woods are still beautiful, still silent, but I approach them now with respect and knowledge, knowing that solitude can be dangerous if underestimated. That trip ended not with tragedy, but with clarity. I returned home safely, forever changed by the experience. I had faced genuine fear and survived, and the memory of that night remains as a vivid lesson in the delicate balance between isolation and safety, between curiosity and caution, and between human confidence and vulnerability. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of spending a few days alone in a cabin in the mountains, away from the noise and pressure of the city, was appealing in ways that were hard to explain. I didn't want anyone else with me. It wasn't a social retreat. It was a personal escape. I packed light but carefully. I made sure to bring extra food, a couple of flashlights, batteries, my hiking boots, a basic first aid kit, a map of the area, and enough water purification tablets to last the entire trip. My plan was simple. Drive to the remote cabin I had rented, lock the door behind me, and spend a few days hiking the trails, fishing in the nearby stream, and reading. It was the perfect plan for peace and solitude. The drive to the cabin was long but uneventful. At first, the winding roads through the mountains seemed almost serene. Tall pines lined the edges of the asphalt, and in the distance, the peaks of the mountains glowed gold in the late afternoon sun. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and occasionally, I caught a glimpse of a deer grazing in a clearing. My excitement grew with every mile. The cabin was said to be completely off the grid, powered by a generator and stocked with basic supplies. There was no cell phone reception, no internet, no noise except for the occasional bird call or the wind through the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, leaving long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. Sturdy, rustic, made of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, even though no one was supposed to be there. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching sharply under my boots. The forest around me was still and quiet in a way that almost made me nervous, but I dismissed the feeling. It was just the unfamiliar silence of the woods. I entered the cabin and immediately noticed how cold it was inside. Even with the sun still high, the thick logs of the walls kept the warmth out. I turned on the lights, which flickered briefly before settling into a dim, steady glow. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something earthy, like damp soil. I unpacked my bag, placing my supplies carefully on the counters and shelves. The kitchen had all the basics: a small stove, a few pans, a stack of plates, and a set of utensils. The living area had a worn couch, a wooden table, and a couple of chairs. A small wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and I could see a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. Upstairs, there were 2 small bedrooms and a bathroom. I set my things down, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. Night fell quickly. The forest seemed darker than I had expected. The shadows between the trees were deep and thick, and the wind made the branches groan like old wood. I decided to make a fire in the stove before settling down. It took longer than I expected. The kindling was damp, and the logs smoked more than they burned at first. I had to rearrange them several times, adding smaller sticks, blowing gently on the flames until finally, a small fire caught. The room warmed slowly, and the flickering light made the cabin feel a little less empty. I ate a simple dinner, a canned stew I had brought with me, and tried to ignore the sound of the wind rattling against the windows. Around midnight, I was startled awake by a sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably just a fallen branch or some animal moving through the forest. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that nothing in these woods could really hurt me, but the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't a continuous noise. It was intermittent, moving along the perimeter of the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears, and then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A series of footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze. My mind raced through the possibilities. Animals made noise, yes, but these were footsteps. Human footsteps. I stayed still for what felt like forever, listening. Then the footsteps stopped, just outside the door. I could hear breathing, uneven, ragged, almost imperceptible over the wind. I held my breath, gripping the handle of a small hatchet I had brought along for safety. The sound lingered, then moved away, fading into the night. I stayed awake for hours after that, every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees setting my nerves on edge. Hours passed. Every small noise made me jump. The wind rattling the porch, the creak slapping against rocks, twigs breaking in the distance. I didn't sleep again that night. I waited, listening, feeling a constant, gnawing tension in my stomach. Morning eventually came, though it offered little comfort. Sunlight filtered weakly through the trees, and the cabin felt empty, oppressive, the way old wooden spaces do when silence stretches too long. I cautiously opened the door, stepping outside. The clearing looked normal, the creek flowing, no signs of anyone or anything having been near. But I noticed the faint marks in the dirt, shallow scratches that weren't there yesterday. They didn't look like animal tracks. I spent the day exploring the perimeter, walking slowly through the forest around the cabin. I carried a large branch as a makeshift weapon. The woods were dense, tangled with undergrowth, and the further I went, the more I realized I couldn't tell where the forest ended or the clearing began. There were no footprints beyond the shallow scratches near the cabin, and nothing else to indicate human presence. It was as if someone had been careful not to leave a trace. The unease grew. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to drop again, feeling watched despite seeing no one. Night came, darker than the first, and I did something I hadn't expected. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the trees. The dragging noise returned, louder this time, closer. It circled the cabin repeatedly. I realized, with a cold clarity, that someone had been watching me. Not just the previous night, both nights now. Someone was deliberately waiting, testing, perhaps even trying to scare me. I considered leaving, but the dirt road was long, and the forest made it impossible to see any further than a few yards ahead. Panic and caution warred in my mind. I spent the third day preparing. I gathered heavy sticks, stones, anything that could serve as a weapon. I barricaded the doors as best I could, stacked chairs and a small table against the door latch. I cleared a path to the fire pit, the creek, and my car so I could run if necessary. I also took inventory of supplies, food for at least a week, water, and my small first aid kit. I planned my escape route, considering how far I would have to run, what I could grab, and where I might hide in the forest if things went wrong. By the afternoon, I had a plan. I would wait for night, then drive as quickly as possible, lights off, tires careful of the rocks and roots. Night came and the dragging noise was back. It seemed to mock me, scraping along the perimeter, now joined by occasional snapping twigs. I felt a presence, deliberate, patient. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving on the porch. Someone had been here. My pulse raced. I grabbed my flashlight and my makeshift weapons, heart hammering. I waited, breath held, ready to defend myself. The steps stopped, and the scraping continued around the cabin. I knew I couldn't stay. I slipped out a side door, crouching low, moving as silently as I could through the underbrush to the car. Every rustle made my heart leap. I reached the vehicle, hands shaking, unlocked it, and jumped in. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the loose dirt. I drove slowly at first, then faster as I gained confidence. The forest blurred, shadows moving along the edges of my vision, the smell of wet soil and pine filling the car. I didn't look back. Every sound behind me felt like danger, every movement a threat. Hours later, I reached the main road, exhaustion hitting me in waves. The streetlights felt surreal after days of darkness and forest. I called the police as soon as I could, giving them the location and the details of what had happened. They told me they would investigate, but the area was so remote that it would take time. I drove to the nearest town, parking at a motel, hands still shaking. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was fitful, filled with dreams of movement in the trees, shadows circling. The investigation revealed something unsettling. There were no intruders found on the property, no signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind beyond the scratches in the dirt. The local authorities suggested the possibility of a stalker or a transient who had used the forest to move undetected. It was enough to make my stomach twist, knowing someone had been so close for days without me seeing them. I never returned to that cabin. Even months later, driving past the area, I would feel a pang of unease, remembering the dragging sounds, the empty darkness, and the sheer, suffocating isolation. I learned something important in those days. Something that didn't involve ghosts or fantasy, only human cunning and patience. Isolation is a powerful tool, and fear is a powerful weapon. When someone is willing to move silently, to watch, to wait, they can terrify without ever being seen. And in the end, survival depends not on luck, but on preparation, awareness, and the courage to act decisively even when every instinct screams for safety. I left with my life, shaken but alive, and with a story that would haunt me in the realistic, unavoidable way that only true danger can. Months later, I told myself I had closure. I had faced a real threat and survived it. I could no longer imagine stepping foot in that cabin, but I also knew I had learned what it truly meant to be alone, to be hunted, and to escape. That knowledge stayed with me, a silent, permanent reminder of the thin line between safety and danger when isolation meets human cunning. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. The thought of waking up in a place that smelled of pine and earth, with nothing but the sound of wind and birds, was soothing. I had found the cabin online, an old wooden structure tucked far away from the main road, hidden in a small valley surrounded by dense forest. The pictures made it look cozy. A stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, a small loft with a mattress, and a kitchen that seemed just barely functional but enough for my needs. I had packed lightly, bringing only essentials. A backpack with food, water, a small first aid kit, matches, a flashlight, a knife, some warm clothes, and a notebook for writing. I wanted a quiet weekend to write, to get away from the noise of the city, to breathe. The drive there had been long and slow. GPS barely worked in that area, and the last few miles were on a narrow dirt road that twisted through hills and thick groves of trees. There were no houses, no other cars, and I kept expecting the road to end in a dead zone or a blocked path. But eventually, I saw the cabin. It was more isolated than I had imagined, sitting in a small clearing with the forest rising sharply behind it. The wood of the cabin was darkened with age, the roof sagging in a few places, the porch creaking faintly in the wind. The feeling of isolation was immediate and profound. I parked the car and stepped out, the air smelling of damp earth and pine resin. I felt a thrill of excitement, mixed with the faint edge of unease. The isolation felt almost too complete. I spent the first few hours unpacking, cleaning, and settling in. I lit a fire in the fireplace, appreciating the way the warmth spread across the room. I prepared a simple meal, looking out the windows at the forest around me. There was no one in sight, no sounds of human life, only birds occasionally calling to one another, the wind rustling through the branches, and the faint creak of the cabin itself as it settled. I told myself I was ready for solitude, but there was a strange weight to the silence that pressed against the walls and seeped into my mind. It was not immediately frightening, but it was the kind of quiet that made you aware of every small sound. The snap of a twig, the scurry of a small animal, the whistle of wind through the roof shingles. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. The first night passed with only the usual creaks and groans of an old building. I slept fitfully, waking occasionally to the wind or some distant, indistinct noise from the forest. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of overcast sky that made everything seem muted and slightly off. I decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat on a small clearing, but beyond that, the forest was dense. Trees pressed close together, their branches tangled and dark. I wandered along a faint trail I found near the back, keeping my senses alert. The ground was damp, leaves and pine needles underfoot making soft sounds that seemed too loud in the empty woods. I noticed how little life seemed to move here. No squirrels, no deer, just the occasional crow. By the second night, the isolation started to weigh on me more heavily. I had read books and written a little, but the silence was oppressive in a way I had not anticipated. I started hearing sounds that seemed too deliberate to be random. A branch snapping, faint at first, then more insistent. The rustle of leaves, like someone or something, was moving just beyond the line of sight in the trees. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to relax. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the air was still and heavy. The forest seemed almost to hold its breath. My heart beat faster as I scanned the darkness just beyond the clearing. The next day, I decided to go further into the forest, following what looked like an old logging trail that curved sharply uphill. I took my knife with me, partly out of habit, partly for comfort. The trail was rough, overgrown, and narrow, and I had to push past low-hanging branches and thick brambles. The forest closed in around me, the sunlight filtering faintly through the canopy, creating irregular patches of light. I felt a constant tension in my shoulders, my ears straining for any sound of movement. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, just for a second, but when I blinked, it was gone. My pulse quickened, and I told myself it was a trick of the light or a shadow. Still, I returned to the cabin earlier than I had planned, feeling the first gnawing sense of real unease. That night, I was awakened by a sound that made my stomach twist. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My first thought was a neighbor or a hunter, but I remembered how remote this place was. No one else could have been here. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, listening. The sound continued, soft but unmistakable, moving around the cabin. I felt my body tense. I thought about going outside, but something in me refused. I stayed in bed, flashlight and knife at hand, waiting. After what felt like hours, the steps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. I didn't sleep well after that. The following day, I tried to stay calm. I explored the nearby creek, telling myself that being out in the open, seeing the water and hearing the birds, would help. I found some wild berries and roots, enough to eat if needed, and collected water from the creek, filtering it. I kept my senses alert, eyes scanning constantly. I noticed signs that someone, or something, had been in the area recently. Broken branches, footprints in the mud that didn't match any deer or bear. They were human. My heart sank. I returned to the cabin, deciding to barricade the doors and windows as best I could. I used furniture to block the main door and nailed a few loose boards across the windows. I spent the evening pacing, checking every entry point, listening for any sound from the woods. The sun disappeared quickly behind gray clouds, and the forest darkened. The wind picked up, shaking branches against the roof. By nightfall, the footsteps returned, louder this time, more purposeful. They circled the cabin, stopping intermittently as if the person outside was studying it. I could hear breathing, uneven, slow. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I checked my phone, no signal. The nearest house was miles away, and I was completely alone. I thought about the knife in my hand, but I knew that would only help in an immediate confrontation. My only advantage was the cabin itself. I stayed low, listening, waiting. Hours passed. The footsteps moved away gradually, but the tension didn't ease. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. The isolation, combined with the idea that someone had been stalking me, made it unbearable. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and left the cabin as quietly as possible. I followed a different trail, hoping it would lead me to a road or a place with some signal. The forest seemed endless, but eventually, I came across tire tracks that looked recent. Following them, I emerged onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me, almost paralyzing. A car passed by, and I waved it down, finally able to speak to another human being and call for help. The authorities later told me that the area had been the site of several recent break-ins and robberies. The cabin I had rented, while advertised as secluded and safe, was known locally to be easy to access for people looking to hide or ambush visitors. They explained that the footsteps I had heard, the signs of someone in the forest, had been part of an attempted intrusion. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. I had survived, and I had been cautious enough to protect myself, but the reality of how vulnerable I had been stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, I processed the experience. I realized that my attraction to isolation had blinded me to the very real risks. I understood that the forest, while beautiful and serene, was not inherently safe, and that solitude can be deceptive. but I also felt a sense of accomplishment. I had maintained my awareness, my composure, and had taken concrete steps to protect myself. The cabin trip had been terrifying, but I had learned something vital about human vulnerability, instinct, and caution. The memories of the footsteps, the circling shadow, the oppressive silence of the cabin stayed with me, but they no longer carried paralyzing fear. They were reminders of the sharp line between adventure and danger. I never returned to that cabin. I wrote down my experience in detail, turning it into a long narrative to process it, including everything I had noticed. The small sounds, the tracks, the way the forest seemed to shift and close in. I used my notebook to analyze every decision I had made, every moment when I had felt fear. In the end, I realized that the cabin, the forest, the isolation, all of it had tested me and I had survived. I had faced something very real, very human, and I had come through with my wits and my life intact. That clarity, the understanding that I could navigate danger and emerge whole, gave me a sense of closure. The fear was gone, replaced by cautious respect and an unshakable awareness that nature and solitude carry their own risks, and human beings can be unpredictable, even in places that feel untouched. I returned home with a renewed sense of vigilance and a deep respect for boundaries. The trip remained a vivid memory, the details etched in my mind. The creaking cabin, the circling steps, the dark forest around me, but it no longer haunted me. I knew that sometimes fear is real, grounded, and dangerous, and surviving it requires more than courage. It requires attentiveness, preparation, and the ability to act without panic. That knowledge stayed with me, shaping the way I approached solitude, travel, and even daily life. I had gone seeking peace in the woods, but I had found something deeper, a confrontation with reality itself, and the clear knowledge that I could endure it. I had been looking forward to a long weekend in the mountains for months. The work year had been relentless, leaving me exhausted and tense, and the idea of escaping to a small, secluded cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect remedy. I had booked a place that was several hours' drive from the nearest town, perched on the side of a hill overlooking a dense forest. The online pictures showed a modest wooden cabin, old but sturdy, surrounded by pine trees and a small clearing. There was no cell signal there, which I considered a bonus. I needed to disconnect. I left early in the morning, driving through the quiet countryside as the sun slowly rose. The air was crisp, and the roads were almost empty. As I climbed the winding mountain roads, the forest grew thicker, the trees taller, their shadows stretching over the road in long, dark fingers. By the time I reached the last turnoff, a narrow dirt track leading up to the cabin, the sun was fully above the horizon, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. The dirt road was rough, pitted with small rocks and occasional ruts, and I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the car. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The cabin was small, with a single main room, a loft above, and a small porch in the front. It looked exactly like the pictures: weathered wood, stone foundation, and a chimney that promised warmth. The surrounding forest was thick and silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the branches and the occasional call of a bird. I parked the car and stepped out, taking in the clearing. I could see the trees rising steeply on all sides, forming a kind of natural wall. Beyond the clearing, I had no idea what might be hidden in the woods. The first hours inside the cabin were relaxing. I unpacked, organized my things, and started a small fire in the stone fireplace. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and old wood, a comforting smell that made it feel like it had been lived in for years. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove and ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches. The sounds were sharp and sudden, making me startle now and then, but I reminded myself it was just the wind. As evening approached, I explored the surroundings of the cabin. The clearing was small, maybe 40 meters across, and the forest beyond was thick and dark. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks creating almost a wall of wood and shadow. The forest floor was covered in pine needles and fallen branches, uneven and soft. I wandered a little, sticking close to the clearing, and noticed signs of wildlife, tracks, chewed bark, and the occasional scat. Nothing dangerous yet, just evidence that animals lived there. The feeling of isolation began to settle in. I was completely alone. Night came quickly in the mountains. The sun set behind the peaks, leaving a deep darkness that swallowed the clearing. I lit more firewood and tried to focus on small tasks. Cleaning, stacking wood, preparing for the night. That's when I first noticed it. A sound outside, sharp and deliberate, that didn't fit the natural noises I had heard before. At first, I thought it was a branch snapping under a falling tree limb. Then it repeated slightly further away, then closer. It wasn't the wind. I froze, listening. The sound came in small bursts, quiet but deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the undergrowth. I told myself it was an animal. Bears lived in this forest, I knew that. Deer, mountain lions, maybe a coyote or two. Still, my chest tightened. The forest seemed too quiet in between the sounds, like it was holding its breath. I went to the door and looked out, holding a flashlight, scanning the edges of the clearing. The light cut through the darkness in a thin beam, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifted between two trees, then it vanished. My mind raced. It was probably nothing. A deer, a raccoon, a trick of the light. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to stay near the fire. The cabin felt safer than the dark forest outside. Hours passed slowly. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I kept peering out the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but the forest swallowed all movement. I checked my supplies, made sure I had water, food, and a flashlight ready. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. I tried to sleep, but every noise made me jolt awake. Morning came, but it brought little relief. I inspected the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see footprints pressed into the mud. They were large, definitely human. They circled the cabin and led off into the forest. I felt my stomach twist. Someone had been here in the night, watching me, moving around while I slept. I called the local ranger station on the landline I found in the cabin, but the line was dead. No signal as expected. I realized then that I was truly alone, completely cut off. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, my hatchet, and a flashlight. I decided to leave the cabin and head down the mountain, back toward the main road, as quickly as possible. The hike down was tense. Every rustle in the trees, every snapping branch underfoot made me jump. I kept imagining someone hiding behind a tree, watching me. My mind played tricks on me, turning ordinary shapes in the forest into figures. The further I got from the cabin, the more my panic grew. I tried to focus on the trail, the map I had brought, but the terrain was rugged, and I slipped several times on loose rocks. I reminded myself to stay calm, but it was hard. My pulse raced constantly. My breath came in short gasps. A few hours into the hike, I reached a small clearing with a stream. I stopped to rest and drink some water. As I bent to scoop water into my bottle, I noticed something in the distance. There was a figure, partially hidden behind a tree on the other side of the clearing. It was difficult to make out details, but it was tall, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, almost as if tracking me. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move quietly, circling the clearing away from the figure, trying to stay hidden. My legs shook with fear and adrenaline. I kept moving, taking longer, winding paths down the mountain, hoping to lose whatever it was that had been following me. Hours passed. The figure never reappeared, but I felt the weight of being hunted. My body was exhausted. My stomach cramped from fear and hunger, and every step felt like it took half my strength. I realized then that surviving wasn't just about reaching the road. It was about keeping my mind sharp, staying calm, and not letting fear paralyze me. Eventually, the forest thinned, and I saw the first glimpse of the main road below. My relief was immense, but I didn't slow down. I ran the last stretch, emerging onto the asphalt with mud-streaked clothes, scratches on my arms from branches, and my heart hammering like a drum. I flagged down a passing car, a couple driving home from a nearby town, and explained my situation as quickly as I could. They drove me to the nearest ranger station, where I filed a report. The rangers took me seriously. They inspected the cabin later and found signs of recent human activity. Footprints, discarded food wrappers, and evidence that someone had been inside while I slept. There were no fingerprints, no clear identity, just the undeniable proof that someone had been watching the cabin. In the days after, I stayed with friends in town, unable to stop thinking about the cabin and the figure in the forest. I realized how easily someone could disappear in those woods, how quickly a place meant for solitude could become a trap. But I also realized that careful preparation, staying alert, and trusting my instincts had saved me. I had survived because I didn't underestimate the danger, because I stayed focused even when fear threatened to overwhelm me. Weeks later, I returned to the city, changed. I avoided going back to the mountains for a long time, but I also felt a strange sense of respect for them. They weren't magical, they weren't haunted. They were real, unpredictable, and capable of hiding dangers that the human mind often ignores. I learned to never take isolation lightly, to always be prepared, and to trust my own instincts above everything else. I had faced something terrifying, and I had come through it alive. That clarity, that knowledge was my victory. Even now, months later, I still think about the cabin, the sound of footsteps circling the building, and the figure in the clearing. I replay it over and over, not with panic, but with understanding. I know exactly what happened. Someone had been using the remote cabin for their own purposes, someone who had noticed me as an easy target. And I had escaped because I respected the danger, because I kept my mind sharp, and because I refused to give in to fear. That night could have been the end, but it wasn't. I survived, and that survival changed me, taught me to see the world differently, to measure risk, and to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But I keep the experience with me, as a reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than we often assume. That even in the quietest, most serene places, real danger can exist. And that sometimes, being alone is not just about solitude. It's about testing your limits, surviving against odds that seem impossible, and learning that clarity and calm are more powerful than any fear. I had been planning the trip for months. I needed a break, a complete disconnect from the world I lived in, from the constant demands and endless noise. Work had been suffocating, life had been suffocating, and I felt like I was crumbling under the weight of it all. The idea of a cabin, isolated and quiet, nestled in the dense forest miles away from civilization, was like a lifeline. I found a small cabin online, tucked away near a remote lake in the mountains. It wasn't advertised as anything special, just a simple wooden cabin with basic amenities, enough to survive comfortably for a week. No electricity, no internet, no one around for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked it without hesitation. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had been long, winding along dirt roads and through thick pine forests. As I turned the last corner, the cabin came into view, its dark wooden frame blending almost completely with the forest around it. It was small but sturdy, with a sloping roof and a stone chimney. A thin plume of smoke curled from the chimney, though I assumed it had been used recently. The cabin sat beside a small clearing, and beyond it, I could see the glint of water reflecting the fading light from the lake. The air was cool, almost crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and wet soil. I parked the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath, letting the silence of the forest fill my lungs. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchenette, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch, and a loft bedroom above. A stack of firewood was neatly arranged next to the fireplace. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and wood polish. I set down my bags, stretched, and let the quiet seep into me. There was no one around, no sounds of traffic, no distant chatter, nothing but the occasional bird and the rustling of leaves. I lit a fire in the fireplace, and as the flames crackled, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. I had arrived, and for the first time in a long while I was truly alone. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, the silence and the darkness wrapping around me like a protective blanket. But when morning came, I noticed how isolated the cabin really was. The sun rose slowly, filtering through the trees, and the lake glimmered faintly through the branches. There were no other cabins nearby, no paths worn into the forest, nothing but trees, rocks, and the thin trail I had followed to get there. I spent the morning gathering firewood and exploring the immediate area, trying to familiarize myself with the surroundings. Everything seemed calm, almost idyllic. By the second day, I realized just how easy it was to feel cut off. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't even tried the old landline in the cabin. It seemed unnecessary. I took long walks along the lake and through the trees, appreciating the solitude. But there was also a growing sense of unease, subtle and creeping, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling that I wasn't supposed to be entirely alone here. I shrugged it off as paranoia, a side effect of isolation. On the third day, things began to change. I woke early, before the sun had fully risen. The forest was silent in a way it hadn't been before. Even the birds were quiet, and the lake lay still like glass. I stepped outside to stretch and saw something that made my heart skip. A trail of footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were small, human footprints, fresh in the soft earth. They weren't mine, they weren't my car's either. I followed them carefully. They led into the forest and then disappeared among the undergrowth. I froze for a moment, trying to tell myself it was probably just a hiker, someone passing by. But something in me didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping, a rustle in the leaves, the splash of a fish in the lake. I kept the fire going constantly, making sure the cabin was warm and lit. That night, I slept lightly, waking at every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls. I kept thinking I saw movement outside, fleeting shadows among the trees, but when I looked, there was nothing. By the fourth day, I realized the situation was escalating. More signs of someone else were appearing. I found small items moved inside the cabin. A firewood log slightly out of place, a chair not quite where I had left it. Outside, the footprints returned, sometimes near the edge of the clearing, sometimes closer to the cabin itself. Whoever it was, they were watching, observing me, but never approaching directly. I felt the tension coil in my chest. I was alone, but I was not alone. I decided to take precautions. I began barricading the doors with furniture, stacking logs and chairs to make entry more difficult. I kept a heavy metal rod by my bed. I also began marking the perimeter, creating a ring around the cabin with rocks and branches, so I would know if someone had approached during the night. Each morning, I checked the surroundings carefully before leaving the cabin. I avoided walking deep into the forest alone, sticking to the small clearing and the path to the lake.